Rufus Vane's thick fingers closed around Adelaide Wren's wrist like a bear trap snapping shut, and not one soul in that saloon moved to stop him. Not one. She had walked into the Broken Spur that evening, believing she still had options. She had walked in with her chin up, her back straight, wearing the last good dress she owned, dark wool, a little frayed at the collar, but dignified. She had walked in the way her father always told her a Wren carried themselves, like they belonged wherever they stood. Rufus Vane looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's already bought. "Horace Wren died owing me $11,000, he announced to the room, not to her. He was speaking to the men lined up along the bar, to the card players who'd frozen mid-deal, to the bartender who was suddenly very interested in polishing a glass. The land's gone. The tools are gone. Everything that old fool owned has been settled except one thing." His eyes moved to Adelaide, slowly, deliberately her. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and truly realized, that not one of them was going to help you, then you already know how Adelaide felt in that moment. If you've ever wondered what you actually would do when there was no one left to call on, no door left to walk through, no name left to lean on, stay with this story. Because what happened next in that saloon didn't just change Adelaide Wren's life. It shook the entire Wyoming frontier to its foundations. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and if this one grabs you, hit that like button. It helps more people find stories worth their time. Now, let's go back to that saloon. The Broken Spur smelled the way it always smelled: wood smoke, wet wool, cheap whiskey, and the particular kind of desperation that settles into a place when a hard winter is coming and money is scarce. October and frostbreak, Wyoming was not a gentle thing. The wind off the ridge had teeth, and it found every gap in every wall, and it reminded everyone inside that the world beyond that door was not their friend. Adelaide had lived in frostbreak her whole life. She knew these men. The bartender, Cal Digby, had carried her father home drunk exactly once, 6 years ago, and Horace had been so embarrassed he'd brought the man a side of venison as apology. The two men playing cards near the window, Amos Fitch and Dale Rudd, had worked survey lines with her father for a decade. They'd eaten at her table. She had poured coffee into their cups with her own hands. None of them looked at her now. Rufus Vane was not a tall man, but he had the kind of physical density that made a room feel smaller when he entered it. He was somewhere past 50, built like a stump, with a jaw that looked carved rather than grown and eyes the particular gray of old ice, the kind that looks solid until you step on it. He wore his wealth the way some men wore weapons, visibly, deliberately, as a reminder of what he could do to people who forgot their place. He had not let go of her wrist. "I'm not a debt," Adelaide said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that, at least. Because the rest of her, the part of her that was 24 years old and alone and genuinely frightened for the first time in her life, the rest of her was not steady at all. Vane tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when something surprises him by still making noise. $11,000 says different, he replied. "My father's debts are not my body," she pulled against his grip. He didn't release her, but she made him work for it. And she saw something flicker behind his ice-gray eyes, not anger yet, just recalibration. He hadn't expected her to resist. Most people in Frostbreak didn't resist Rufus Vane. Most people in Frostbreak had learned, one way or another, that resisting Rufus Vane had a cost that came due in the night, in the cold, in the kind of accidents that left no witnesses. "Your father," Vane said, and his voice dropped to something that was almost conversational, made agreements he couldn't honor. That's a reflection of his character. What happens next is a reflection of yours. Then my character says you let go of my arm. Someone at the bar made a sound, half laugh, half cough, swallowed quickly. Vane's head turned just a fraction toward the sound, and whatever had almost escaped from that man's throat died instantly. That was when Adelaide understood the full geometry of her situation. It wasn't just that no one was going to help her. It was that every single person in this room, people she'd known her entire life, people her father had helped and fed and done right by, had already made their calculation. Vane was the winter, and they were all just trying to get to spring. She was on her own. The thought didn't arrive with the dramatic weight she might have expected. It arrived the way cold water does, immediate, clarifying, stripping away everything that isn't essential. She had no money. She had no property. She had a dead father, whose reputation she was only now beginning to understand might have been more complicated than she knew. She had a dress with a frayed collar. She had 2 hands, which one of them was currently occupied. And she had about 30 seconds before Rufus Vane got tired of being patient. "Come along now," he said, and he pulled her forward. Adelaide did the only thing left available to her. She dug her heels into the floorboards, and she pulled back with everything she had. And she looked directly at Amos Fitch, who had eaten her food and used her father's survey equipment, and had known her since she was 12 years old, and she said, plainly and clearly, "Amos, you're going to let this happen." Amos Fitch looked at his cards. That was his answer. That was everyone's answer. The cards, glass, the floor, the far wall, anything that wasn't Adelaide Wren and Rufus Vane, and the ugly arithmetic of a debt being collected. Vane jerked her arm hard enough to make her stumble forward, 1 step, 2, and for a moment she genuinely thought that was it, that the story ended here. In the Broken Spur, in October, the wind howling outside, and Cal Digby polishing a glass that was already clean. Then the doors blew open, not gently, not the way a person enters a room, the way a storm does. Both panels of the heavy saloon door swung wide, and a wall of frozen air punched through the room so hard that 3 card hands scattered across the floor, and a lantern guttered nearly to nothing. Snow followed the air fine, biting, the kind that got into your eyes before you could blink, and in the middle of all of it stood a shape that Adelaide's mind took a moment to resolve into a human being. It was enormous. That was the first thing. Not fat, not soft enormous. The way a mountain is enormous, the way something is enormous that has been shaped by forces you don't fully understand. He wore hides and wool and canvas, layered in ways that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with survival. His beard was dark with frost at the edges. There was a scar that ran from somewhere near his left eye down across his jaw, catching the lamplight in a way that made it look like a crack in stone. He had to turn slightly sideways to clear the doorframe. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, it seemed, for a full 3 seconds. Rufus Vane released Adelaide's wrist, not because he was afraid. Vane didn't operate through fear. Exactly, he operated through calculation, and his calculation was currently updating itself in real time, processing this new variable that had just walked in from the blizzard. His men, 2 of them, stationed near the bar, had gone very still in the way that armed men go still when they're deciding whether a situation has changed. The enormous man in the doorway didn't look at them. He looked at the bar. He walked to it, each footfall heavy on the old planks, deliberate, unhurried, and he reached into the folds of his coat and he pulled out a leather sack that hit the bar with a sound like a chunk of rock hitting the ground. A solid sound, a substantial sound. Cal Digby's hand stopped moving on the glass. The man pulled the sack open with 2 fingers and upended it slowly. Raw gold. Not coin, not dust raw gold. Chunks of it, the kind that comes straight out of the mountain before it has been rendered into anything civilized. It spread across the bar in a loose pile that caught every lamp in the room and held it. Digby stared at it. One of Vane's men leaned forward slightly. Vane's jaw worked once, silent. The man looked at Digby. What was the debt? His voice was unexpected. Not the growl Adelaide had anticipated from someone who looked like he'd been assembled from leftover wilderness. Lower than that, but clear, like stone hitting stone. Like something that didn't need volume to carry. Digby hesitated. He looked at Vane. He looked back at the gold. He said 11 Rufus has it set at 11,000s. That cover it? Digby's hands moved through the pile on the bar with the practiced speed of a man who had spent his life handling money in various forms. His mouth moved silently. He looked up. Covers it twice over, he said. The room held its breath. Rufus Vane had gone very quiet. That was more frightening than anything he'd done to Adelaide in the previous 5 minutes, because Vane quiet meant Vane thinking. And Vane thinking meant someone was going to pay for something, and the only question was the ledger. The man at the bar finally turned around. He was not young, somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40, though the wilderness had done its own accounting on his face, and the numbers were hard to read. He had the hands of someone who worked with them, scarred, thick-jointed, calloused in ways that told a story Adelaide couldn't fully interpret. He looked at her directly, not the way Vane had looked at her, not assessing, not calculating ownership, just looking, taking in the situation, deciding something. He said 2 words, "She leaves with me," and the saloon, which had already been very quiet, became the kind of quiet that exists between lightning and thunder. Adelaide looked at this man she had never seen before. This mountain-shaped stranger who had walked out of a blizzard with a fortune in raw gold and spent it in 30 seconds without blinking. This man who had just told a room full of people, including Rufus Vane, including Vane's armed men, that she was leaving with him. Every rational instinct she possessed was cataloging the obvious problems. She didn't know him. He was terrifying to look at. She had no guarantee that whatever waited in the mountains with this man was any safer than whatever waited in town with Rufus Vane. She had been rescued from one stranger's grip by another stranger entirely. The word rescue carried an assumption that might not survive daylight. But she also knew what she'd just felt under Vane's hand. She knew what she'd seen in Amos Fitch's eyes when he looked at his cards instead of at her. She had 4 seconds to make a decision that would determine the rest of her life. She stepped forward. "All right," she said. Rufus Vane's voice came from behind her, and it was the voice he used when he was done being patient, flat, cold, and very precise. "Holloway." The man Holloway stopped. He didn't turn immediately. When he did, it was slow, like something large changing direction. "You think gold clears this?" Vane said. "You think this is over?" "The debt's cleared," Holloway said. "That was the matter on the table. There are other matters. Tonight there aren't." Something passed between the 2 men, something that had history in it, Adelaide sensed, history she wasn't yet equipped to understand. Vane's gray eyes moved from Holloway to her and back, and she could see the calculations still running. Updating, reaching a conclusion. "Walk out that door," Vane said softly, "and you'll wish you'd stayed in your mountains." Holloway looked at him for 1 more second. Then he turned, pulled open the ruined saloon door, and walked back out into the blizzard. Adelaide followed him. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind tore at her coat immediately, found the gap at her collar, drove ice crystals against her face. She couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. She could hear almost nothing over the roar of the storm, and the warm light of the broken spur disappeared behind her, in roughly the time it took to draw a breath. She caught up to the shape ahead of her, or tried to. He was moving without hesitation, which meant he knew where he was going, which meant he'd done this before, or something like it. "Where are we going?" she shouted over the wind. He didn't answer immediately. She grabbed his arm, or the layers of coat covering his arm, which required a significant grip, and repeated it. He turned his head enough to make her visible. "Up," he said. That was his entire answer. Up, up into the mountains, up into the blizzard, up into the darkness beyond the settlement's last light. Adelaide let go of his coat. She stood there in the snow for approximately 3 seconds, wind screaming around her, the warmth of the saloon irretrievably behind her, and this enormous, silent stranger ahead of her. She thought about Rufus Vane's hand on her wrist. She thought about Amos Fitch looking at his cards. She thought about her father, about the kind of man Horace Wren had actually been, about the things she'd believed about him, and the things that were perhaps now coming undone. Then she started walking. She didn't run to catch up. She walked, steadily through snow that was already past her ankles. She fixed her eyes on the shape of Bram Holloway ahead of her, and she kept walking. Because the one thing her father had taught her that she never once doubted was this: a wren doesn't stop when the road gets hard. She just finds different boots. Holloway glanced back once, just once, when she was maybe 20 feet behind him, and whatever he saw in her face or her posture or the way she was moving through the snow made him adjust his pace. Slightly, barely enough to notice, but she noticed. The lights of Frostbreak faded behind them. The mountain rose ahead of them. An Adelaide Wren educated daughter of a dead surveyor, woman who had been offered as payment for a debt she never owed, person who had just watched every familiar thing in her world recede into a blizzard, Adelaide Wren walked forward into the dark and the cold and the utterly unknown. Behind them, in the broken spur, Rufus Vane had not moved. He stood exactly where he'd been when Holloway turned and left. His two men were looking at him, waiting. The room was waiting. Even the wind seemed to be waiting to see what Vane would decide, what calculation had finished running, what conclusion had been reached. He picked up one piece of raw gold from the pile on the bar, turned it in his fingers, set it down. Find out everything, he said to no one in particular and everyone in particular. Where he goes. What he has, what the girl knows. Cal Digby said nothing. Amos Fitch said nothing. Dale Rudd, who had spent 10 years following Adelaide's father across survey lines, who had known her since she was 12 years old, stared at his cards and said nothing. And tell Creed to start watching the passes, Vane added. He walked out of the broken spur without touching his coat, as if the cold outside didn't apply to him, as if the blizzard was someone else's problem. In the mountains above Frostbreak, two figures moved through the snow in single file, one enormous and unhurried, one smaller and getting colder by the minute. Adelaide could no longer feel her fingers inside her gloves, kept walking. She had 1,000 questions, and she knew none of them would be answered tonight. And she had stepped off every solid surface she'd ever stood on and was now moving on faith, which was not something she was accustomed to. Who was Bram Holloway? Why did Vane know his name? Why had her father's name felt in that room like a secret that had been kept from her? Why had a man who hadn't spoken to another person in years walked out of a blizzard and spent a fortune in 2 minutes to drag her out of a situation that was technically none of his business? The wind answered none of it. The mountain offered nothing except itself, enormous and cold and indifferent, and, in some way that Adelaide could not yet name, also somehow exactly as terrifying and exactly as necessary as whatever she had left behind in the valley below. She kept walking. That was the first choice. There would be harder ones. They walked for 3 hours. Adelaide knew this because she counted. Not precisely, she had no watch. And the storm had eaten whatever sky might have told her something, but she counted her own breathing, counted the times she stumbled and caught herself, counted the number of times she considered stopping and did not stop. 3 hours was her estimate. It felt longer. It felt like the kind of time that exists outside of clocks, the kind that rearranges itself once you're inside it. Holloway said nothing for the entire climb. That was its own kind of communication. He wasn't ignoring her, she had the sense, somehow, of being peripherally tracked, the way a man tracks something moving at the edge of his vision without turning his head. When she slipped on a frozen slope and her knee hit rock, he was there before she'd fully registered falling, one hand under her arm, setting her back upright, releasing her the moment she had her footing. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't say anything at all. He just made sure she didn't fall down the mountain and then kept walking. She decided, somewhere in the second hour, to stop being frightened of him specifically and redirect that energy toward not dying in general. It was a more productive use of herself. The lodge materialized out of the storm like something she might have imagined. Her first impression was warmth, not actual warmth yet. She was still outside, and the wind was still finding every gap in her coat but the shape of warmth. The structure was low and heavy, built against an outcropping of rock like it had grown there rather than been placed there, with a roof that angled sharply to shed snow and walls that looked 3 feet thick at minimum. Light came from somewhere inside, faint orange through what she gradually identified as windows, actual glass windows, not oilskin, not boards. Holloway pushed the door open, and the warmth hit her like a hand. She stood in the doorway for probably 5 seconds, which was 5 seconds longer than made practical sense given that she was letting the heat out, but she couldn't make herself move because what she was looking at didn't match anything she'd constructed in her mind during those 3 hours of walking. She had expected dirt floors, a bedroll, a rifle, some traps, the bones of things he'd eaten. The bare, utilitarian arrangement of a man who had chosen the wilderness over civilization and furnished his life accordingly. What she saw was a room full of books, not a few books, not a modest shelf of practical references. Books stacked on shelves that ran floor to ceiling on two walls, organized in a system she couldn't immediately identify, but that was clearly a system, not chaos, not accumulation, but intent. Between the shelves, maps, survey maps, geological maps, topographical drawings of the kind her father had produced, pinned and layered and annotated in handwriting too small to read from the doorway. A worktable beneath the largest window held instruments she recognized from her father's study drafting tools, compasses, measuring devices of various kinds, a transit level she hadn't seen outside of a professional surveying kit. On a second table, rougher and pushed to one side as if it was less important, ammunition, trapping equipment, a collection of blades in various states of maintenance. A fireplace large enough to heat the whole space burned with the focused efficiency of something tended carefully, not just lit and left. "Close the door," Holloway said. She closed the door. He was already moving coat off, hung on a specific peg without looking at it. Boots knocked against the wall to clear the packed snow, moving through the space with the ease of someone who knew where every object was in the dark. He went to the fire and added 2 pieces of wood, adjusted something she couldn't identify, and turned to look at her. She was still standing at the door. "You're going to lose those fingers," he said with a nod toward her hands. She looked down. Her gloves' wool, not adequate for what they'd just walked through, were soaked through. She couldn't feel her fingertips, which was the problem he was pointing out. She knew enough to know that was the problem. She pulled the gloves off. Her fingers were white at the tips, the kind of white that preceded pain, not accompanied it. "Come here." He had moved to the fireplace and was holding out his hand not imperatively, just indicating the space nearest the heat. She crossed the room and stood where he indicated and held her hands toward the fire. The pain arrived about 90 seconds later, which is exactly how long it takes for sensation to come back into fingers that were approaching real trouble. And it was the particular vicious pain of warmth returning to cold tissue burning, stabbing, deeply unpleasant. She made a sound she hadn't intended to make. "Keep them there," he said. He'd turned away, was doing something at a shelf she couldn't see. "I know," she said through her teeth. He came back with a blanket wool, heavy smelling of wood and pine, and dropped it over her shoulders without ceremony. She grabbed the edges with hands that were still hurting and pulled it tighter. "Sit down before you fall down," he said. "I'm not going to fall down. You've been on your feet for 6 hours, 3 of them in a blizzard. You're going to fall down." She wanted to argue with this on principle, and then her legs provided their own opinion about the matter by going suddenly shaky in a way she found very difficult to disguise, and she sat. There was a chair near the fire, a real chair, not a stump, not a crate, and she sat in it with as much dignity as the situation allowed, which was not very much. She looked up at him. He was standing at a slight distance, watching her with the same careful peripheral quality she'd noticed on the climb, attentive without appearing to be. "Why?" she said. He didn't ask what she meant. He crossed to the other chair. There were only 2, she noticed, which told her something, and sat down in it with the particular heaviness of a man who was also tired, though he would be unlikely to say so. "Your father helped me," he said, a few years back. He didn't have to. Most people in that valley don't do things they don't have to. Adelaide stared at him. "That's it," she said. "That's why there was a fortune on that bar." That was real gold. It's real gold, a fortune. "I have more." She absorbed that then. "My father helped you." "How?" Holloway leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the fire for a moment before he looked at her. There was something he was deciding. She could see it, not what to tell her, but how much. How far into something to go with a woman he didn't know on the basis of what he owed her father. "What do you know about the land east of the Frostbreak Badlands?" he said. "Nothing. No one does anything with that land. It's considered worthless, wrong terrain for cattle, too rough to farm." "It's not worthless." Something changed in the temperature of the room, though the fire hadn't moved. Adelaide straightened slightly. "What's under it?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her like she'd surprised him, which was, she suspected, not a thing that happened to him often. "You're quick," he said. "My father was a surveyor. I grew up watching men red land." She kept her eyes on him. "What's under it?" Holloway stood up. He went to the large table with the maps and spent a moment locating something in a layered stack, pulling out a sheet of geological drawings, annotated extensively, covered in measurements and notations, and the particular kind of precise professional markings that Adelaide had seen all her childhood on her father's drafting table. He set it on the chair arm beside her. She looked at it. Her eyes moved through the notations with a familiarity that surprised even her father had narrated his work, her entire childhood, and some of it had apparently embedded itself deeper than she'd known. She traced a formation on the page, a vein indicated by a specific type of cross-hatching she recognized. She looked up. "How deep?" she said. "Deep enough that nobody went looking," he said. "Shallow enough that it's workable." "How much?" He named a figure. Adelaide sat very still for a moment. "That's not possible," she said. "I know what I found," he said. "Not defensive, just flat, factual. The way a man speaks when he's done arguing about something because the evidence made the argument unnecessary years ago." She looked back at the geological drawing. Her hands had stopped hurting. She noticed the warmth had done its work, and she could feel all of her fingers again, which was relevant information. She made herself think, made herself put together what he was telling her with what she knew. "Vane," she said slowly. "Vane wanted the Badlands. Vane has been trying to acquire the Badlands for 11 years. But he doesn't know why." "He didn't know why," Holloway said. "When I first found the formation, I needed the survey documented. Official, clean, undeniable. I needed someone who knew the land and knew how to do it without drawing attention." He paused. "Your father was the best land surveyor in the territory. And he was honest, which is rarer." Adelaide looked at him. "He knew about this," she said. Her voice was careful, measuring each word the way you measure something that might break if you're not paying attention. "My father knew about this gold formation. He documented it. Filed the paperwork through a land office in Denver. Not here, I didn't trust the local office. Your father made 2 trips to Denver over the course of a year and a half. He told people he was visiting a cousin." Adelaide's mouth opened and then closed. She did not have a cousin in Denver. She had never known her father to visit a cousin in Denver. She had never known her father to lie to her about anything. "He kept it from me," she said, and her voice came out flatter than she intended, not hurt. Exactly. Or not only hurt, but the particular kind of hollowness that arrives when you realize a shape you've been sure of has different edges than you thought. "He kept it from everyone," Holloway said, at my request. "I told him the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone would be." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't anticipate how right I'd turn out to be." Adelaide looked at the fire. She thought about her father, about Horace Wren, who had been gentle and brilliant and meticulous, and sometimes so absorbed in his work that he forgot to eat, who had read to her from engineering texts and surveying manuals with the same enthusiasm other fathers brought to fairy stories, who had died 4 months ago in what was called an accident involving a horse in a creek, crossing on a trail he had ridden 100 times without incident. A trail he had ridden 100 times without incident. "He didn't fall off his horse," she said. It wasn't a question. Holloway didn't answer immediately. The fire popped. Snow moved against the windows. Outside, the blizzard was doing what blizzards do in Wyoming in October, which is to say it was making the world into a white, indifferent void. "No," he said. The word landed in the room like something heavy dropped from a height. Adelaide's hands closed on the edges of the blanket. She didn't cry. She noted that about herself. Somewhere at a level beneath emotion, she didn't cry because the crying had happened already. In the weeks after the funeral, and what was sitting in her chest right now was something different from grief. Something colder and more angular. "He arranged it," she said. "Vane. I believe so. I haven't been able to prove it. Yet and then he manufactured the debt. Your father had some real debts, small ones, manageable. Nothing like what Vane produced. The ledger Vane brought to that saloon tonight was not your father's ledger." She breathed in slowly, breathed out. "You knew he was going to do that," she said. "That's why you came." Holloway looked at her steadily. "I suspected he'd move on you once Horace was gone. Vane's been patient for years. He's gotten most of what he wanted through patience. But he's also running out of time. There's a federal land survey coming through this territory next year, And if he doesn't control the Badlands claim by then, he may never get it. So yes, I was watching. You were watching, Adelaide repeated. From where? From where I watch most things. That landed as a slightly uncomfortable piece of information, the idea of this enormous, scarred, mostly silent man watching frost break from the ridges, for however long, noting movements and patterns and the particular rhythms of Rufus Vane's patients. It was unsettling, and also, she had to admit, relevant to why she was currently alive and warm, instead of whatever the alternative was. The deed, she said. You says it was filed in Denver. Holloway got up again. He went to the bookshelves, not the survey table. The bookshelves in Adelaide watched him locate a specific volume, a geology reference by the look of the spine, and open it. From inside its pages, he produced a folded document. He brought it to her. She unfolded it. It was a land deed. The language was formal and dense, the stamps and signatures of the Denver land office across the bottom, dated roughly 2 years ago. The claimants listed were 2 names. The first was Bram Holloway. The second was Horace Ellis Wren. Adelaide sat with the document in her hands for a long time. The fire burned down slightly, and Holloway added another piece of wood without her asking, without making any particular ceremony of it. He sat back in his chair and let her sit with what she was holding. He put me on it, she said finally. Your name was added after. Your father's doing, not mine. He came back from the second Denver trip and told me he'd amended the documentation. Said if anything happened to him, it should go to you. Holloway's voice was careful, picking each word with the same attention he'd given to reading that blizzard on the way up. I told him nothing was going to happen to him. He said I was probably right, but he'd rather be careful than sorry. Horace Wren had always rather been careful than sorry. It was one of his signature phrases. Adelaide folded the deed along its original creases and held it in her lap. You should have told me, she said, when he died. You should have come and told me. I know. I spent 4 months thinking it was an accident. I spent 4 months. She stopped. The angular cold thing in her chest was getting in the way of her voice. I grieved an accident. That's a very different thing than what I was actually grieving. I know that too, he said. I was wrong not to come. He didn't offer a reason. She appreciated that more than she might have expected. Reasons in her experience had a way of sounding like excuses once you put them out in the air. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't permitted herself to yet, the way you hold off on examining something until you're sure you have enough ground under you. He was not what she'd expected when the doors blew open in the broken spur. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Exactly the ghost of Frostbreak Ridge was something people said to frighten children into staying on the lower trails, a story that had calcified into local legend over the years of his isolation. She'd expected something that matched the name, something that lived in the dirt and spoke in grunts. What she was looking at was a man with grease under his fingernails from machinery she hadn't yet identified, who had a transit level on his work table and geological surveys pinned in organized layers on his walls and 2 chairs by his fire. Who owned more books than the Frostbreak schoolhouse? What did you do, she said, before? Engineer, mining engineer, mostly. Some structural work. He glanced around the lodge without self-consciousness, as if the room was answer enough, which it sort of was. I was with a firm out of Philadelphia for 6 years. Before the mountains, why did you leave? He was quiet for longer than the previous questions had made him. That's a longer conversation, he said. We appear to have time, she said. Given the blizzard, something moved at the edges of his expression, not quite a smile, not quite amusement. Something in the vicinity. My partner at the firm, he said finally, had a habit of filing claims under names other than those of the people who'd done the finding, using firm resources, firm backing, firm connections, but recording the claims under arrangements that sent the money to specific people, none of whom were the ones who'd done the work. He paused. I found out. I filed a report with the relevant parties. The relevant parties turned out to have arrangements with my partner. They pushed you out, Adelaide said. They did considerably more than push, he said. He turned his head slightly to one side, and the lamplight caught the scar along his jaw from a different angle. She did not ask about it, not yet. And Vane, she said. Do you know him from before? Vane was one of the names, he said. In the arrangements. one of the men receiving money for other men's work. He wasn't the central figure, he was a beneficiary. But he had connections east, and when I came west to start over, I made the mistake of not understanding that west wasn't far enough. Adelaide looked at the deed in her lap. So it was not just about the Badlands gold. Or it was about the gold, but the gold was only the most recent instance of something that had been running between these two men for longer than she'd existed in either of their lives. Holloway had exposed Vane as a fraud in Philadelphia, and Vane had followed the money west and was now doing what men like Vane do when they've decided the problem with the world is that certain people in it haven't been sufficiently punished. He killed my father, she said, to get to you. To get to the deed, Holloway said. And to you, because he assumed controlling you was the path to the deed. He looked at her directly. He didn't know your father had put your name on it. He thought Horace was the sole link. Once Horace was gone, Vane expected to find the documentation in your father's office. He tore the office apart, Adelaide said, 3 weeks after the funeral. I thought he was looking for evidence of the debts. He was looking for the deed. He didn't find it, because it was in Denver. Because it was in Denver, she let that sit for a moment. The fire had settled into a steadier burn, throwing orange light across the walls, across the stacked books and pinned maps, and the careful, organized life of a man who had retreated from the world and built something exact and private in its place. And now he'll come here, she said. It wasn't a question. She had already understood this in the saloon, or the part of her that operated below conscious thought had already understood it, the part that had made her step forward when the rest of her was cataloging reasons to stay. Not tonight, Holloway said. Not in this storm, not without knowing what he's dealing with. But yes. When he understands what happened, what I actually did tonight, not just paying a debt, but connecting myself to you, to the claim, making you visible to anyone who might be watching, he'll come. So we need to be ready. Holloway looked at her again. With that expression she was beginning to identify, the one that suggested she'd said something that surprised him, though he was working to keep that surprise from becoming visible. He said. I'm not going back down that mountain, she said. Not to hand him what he wants, and I'm not going to sit in a corner while you decide what happens to my father's legacy. She held up the deed. This has my name on it. My father put it there. That was his decision about what I was capable of. She set the deed on the arm of the chair. Was he wrong? The question hung between them. Holloway looked at her for a long moment, long enough that it began to feel like the kind of look that was measuring something, not dismissing. No, he said. Horace was rarely wrong about people. Then tell me what we're dealing with. All of it. How many men does Vane have? What the terrain looks like between here and the valley. What you know about the passes. She pulled the blanket tighter. And then tell me what you know about that formation, because if it's half of what that deed suggests, we're not just protecting a claim. We're protecting something that changes everything for everyone in this territory. He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and went to the map table, and he began to spread things out, and he began to talk. It took 3 hours. The blizzard didn't stop. If anything, it got worse sometime around midnight, pressing against the walls of the lodge with a sustained ferocity that made conversation feel slightly surreal. 2 people making plans inside a box of howling white. But the walls held. The fire held. And Holloway talked in the way that people talk when they've been holding something for a long time and finally have someone to hold it with, not freely, not easily, but thoroughly. He went back when he'd glossed over something and corrected it. He answered her questions without making her feel like the questions were inconvenient. When she caught an inconsistency in the survey measurements and pointed it out, he looked at where she was pointing, checked his records, and said, "You're right," without any particular drama about it. By the time the fire had burned down to coals and the storm had begun to quiet outside, Adelaide had a reasonable picture of what they were sitting on and what was coming for it. The formation was real, and it was staggering. Holloway had been conservative with her earlier. The actual numbers in the survey documents were not conservative. The gold-bearing rock ran beneath the Badlands in a seam that made the existing Wyoming mine operations look like someone digging in their garden. The legal claim was sound documented through legitimate channels, with witnesses, filed properly, with copies held in Denver. Vane could not simply produce a counterfeit deed and expect it to hold in any court that hadn't been previously bought. Which meant Vane needed to either destroy the existing deed and everyone who knew about it, or produce enough local pressure to make the legal process irrelevant. He'd spent years doing the second thing. He was very good at it. The first option, destroying the deed and everyone connected to it, had become more complicated tonight. Adelaide pulled the blanket around her and looked at the coals. "You know this building," she said. "You know every pass, every approach, every choke point between here and the valley." "I've been here 11 years, he said. "Then that's what we have," she said. "We can't outrun him, and we can't outspend him in terms of men." "But we know the ground," she looked at him. "An engineer could do something with this terrain." He looked at her steadily. "An engineer could do quite a lot," he said slowly. "Then we stop running," she said. "We stop waiting for him to come and decide. We make this mountain ours. We make it something he can't simply ride up with 20 men and take." Something shifted in Holloway's expression, something that had been braced against her. Some expectation he'd been carrying of how this conversation would go adjusted itself. He'd expected her to want to run, to take the deed and the gold and find some safer corner of the country. He had not expected her to look at the mountain like it was a tool. Outside, the blizzard was finally beginning to ease, the wind dropping from a roar to something lower, snow thinning. The first suggestion of a gray pre-dawn light was beginning to find the windows not much, just a thinning of the dark. Adelaide was shivering again, the fire too low now to fully reach her across the room. "There's a room," Holloway said, standing. "At the back. It's small, it's warm." He paused. "This isn't, I want to be clear about what this is. You're not a prisoner here. The door is not locked. You can leave whenever the passes are clear." Adelaide looked at him. "I know," she said. "If I thought I was a prisoner, I'd have dealt with that already." His expression did the not quite a smile thing again. "Get some sleep," he said. "We have a lot of work to do." She got up, still wrapped in the blanket, and crossed the lodge toward the back room. At the doorway, she stopped. "Holloway," she said. He looked up from banking the fire. "My father trusted you," she said. "That was his judgment about you. He trusted very few people." She paused. "I'm going to assume he was right until I have evidence otherwise." He held her gaze for a moment. "Fair," he said. She went to bed in a room she'd never seen, in a mountain she barely knew, with Rufus Vane gathering himself somewhere in the valley below, and a dead father's decision sitting folded on a chair arm on the other side of a wall. She slept hard, and without dreaming the way people sleep when they have spent everything available, and there is nothing left to run on. Outside, the storm finally broke. The stars came over Frostbreak Ridge, cold and vast, and completely indifferent to what was sleeping in the lodge below them, to what was scheming in the valley, to the particular and fragile arrangements of human beings, trying to hold something worth keeping in a world that kept trying to take it. In the morning there would be a great deal to do, for now the mountain was quiet, and in the quiet, something was beginning not gently, not neatly, but the way most real things begin, sideways, in the dark, while someone else is doing something else entirely, and nobody has quite caught up to what it actually is yet. The morning after the blizzard was the kind of morning that makes you forget, briefly, that anything in the world is wrong. The storm had deposited 2 feet of fresh snow on the ridge, and the sunrise hit it at an angle that turned everything silver and blue and almost impossibly still. The lodge sat in that stillness like something that had always been there and always would be, and for approximately 4 minutes after Adelaide woke up and stood at the window of the back room, she let herself exist inside that illusion. Then she heard Holloway moving in the main room and remembered exactly where she was and what was coming, and the 4 minutes ended the way such moments always do, not dramatically, just quietly, like a door closing on its own. She had slept in her clothes. There was no alternative. Her bag was in a boarding house room in Frostbreak, which felt like it belonged to another lifetime. She found a basin of water near the window, cold enough to make her eyes water, and she used it, and she ran her fingers through her hair and put it back up as best she could without pins, which was not very well at all. and she decided that her appearance was approximately the last thing that mattered and went out to the main room. Holloway was at the work table. He had a survey map spread out and weighted at the corners with stones, and he was drawing on it with a precision that didn't match the hour or the fact that he'd been awake at least as long as she had. There was a pot on the fire and the smell of coffee, which she moved toward without asking. The mug was where anyone sensible would put a mug on the shelf closest to the fire, within reach without crossing the room. She noted that about the lodge more and more, everything was where it made practical sense to be. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was placed for appearance. The entire space was organized around the question of what works, and it worked the way it looked efficiently, without waste, with the kind of quiet functionality that is very difficult to achieve and that most people mistake for simplicity. She poured coffee and stood by the fire and looked at what he was drawing. He was marking positions, not on the geological survey, on a topographical map of the terrain between the lodge and the valley floor. He had the ridge marked, the approaches from the south, the two main passes that a large group of men with horses could realistically use in winter conditions. He was annotating something near the narrow gulch that the western approach ran through. She moved closer. Controlled charges, she said, reading the annotation. Placed correctly, he said. Without looking up, that gulch becomes impassable. They'd have to go around to the eastern pass, which is, he pointed, here. Longer approach. One natural choke point here, and a secondary here. With enough preparation, 2 people could slow 20 men considerably. Slow, she said, not stop. Nothing stops 20 men permanently except killing most of them, he said. Slow is what we have. Slow buys time and time buys options. She looked at the map. Her father had taught her to read topographical drawings. Terrain was terrain, whether you were surveying it for a land deed or planning what to do when a cattle magnate's hired army was climbing toward you through the snow. You'd need someone monitoring the eastern approach while you work the gulch, she said. Yes, that would be me. He put the pencil down and looked at her directly. Not dismissively, she was beginning to understand that Holloway's version of dismissiveness was simply silence, and he wasn't giving her that. He was looking at her the way he looked at a problem thoroughly from several angles. You've never fired a rifle in your life, he said. I've fired a pistol. That's not the same. I know it's not the same. So teach me. He picked the pencil back up. We have time, he said. Probably. He paused. Vane's going to spend a few days finding out what happened. He knows my name. He's always known where I was, roughly. But he'll want to understand the claim before he moves. He'll try to find out what the deed covers, what it's worth. He doesn't actually know the numbers, which means we have a week. Maybe 2, if we're fortunate. Less if he has someone in Denver who can pull the filed records. Adelaide drank her coffee. It was terrible coffee, too strong, slightly burnt, the kind that a person drinks alone for years, because no one has ever told them it's too strong. She drank it without comment. Then we start today, she said. They started that day. What followed was not the montage that stories sometimes make of hard work, the clean compression of time, the effortless acquisition of skill, the satisfying arc of transformation in 3 minutes. What followed was difficult and unglamorous and frequently humiliating for Adelaide in small ways she hadn't anticipated, and it mattered exactly because of that. The rifle lesson happened on the first morning, in the cleared space south of the lodge, where the snow was trampled flat and a line of rocks at increasing distances served as targets. Holloway's buffalo rifle was not a weapon designed for a person of Adelaide's size, and her first understanding of this came when she lifted it to her shoulder, and it immediately wanted to go somewhere that wasn't her shoulder. Other way, Holloway said. I know which way. Your elbow is wrong. My elbow? Here, he adjusted her arm without asking, which she would have objected to if the adjustment hadn't immediately made the rifle seat against her shoulder instead of sliding off it. She recalibrated her objection and said nothing. Now look down the sight. She looked down the sight. The rock she was aiming at was 20 yards away, which felt very far when viewed through an inch of iron. Breathe, he said. Don't hold it. Let it out slow. I know about breathing. Your shoulders are up around your ears. She lowered her shoulders. Breathe out. Pull when it feels natural. did not feel natural. The trigger required more pressure than she expected, and when the rifle fired, the recoil knocked her backward one full step, and the noise was a physical event. Not just a sound, it went through her chest and through her jaw and rattled things she hadn't previously been aware of. The rock sat exactly where it had been, undisturbed. She lowered the rifle. Holloway said nothing. Again, she said. She fired 11 more shots that morning. She hit the rock twice, glancing hits, not center, but hits. By the end of the session, her shoulder was developing what would become an impressive bruise. Her ears were ringing in a way that persisted through lunch, and her hands had developed a tremor from the cold and the sustained effort that she did not mention. Holloway made soup. Not ceremonially, he made it the way he did everything, without fuss, with the focused practicality of a man who understood that people need food, and this is how you make it available. It was better than the coffee, not by a large margin, but better. She ate and didn't talk, and he ate and didn't talk, and the silence was the kind of silence that two people settle into when they've been working together for half a day and have run out of the particular anxiety that requires noise. It wasn't comfortable yet, it wasn't familiar, but it had stopped being tense in the specific way that two strangers sharing a small space are tense, and that was something. "Your father," Holloway said, at some point in the middle of the soup, used to narrate while he worked. Adelaide looked up. "I know," she said. "Didn't matter what it was. Measuring angles, making notes. He'd talk through it. I'd never had a partner who did that. He was looking at the soup. Then it wasn't." She watched him. "You miss him," she said. He took a moment. "He was," Holloway said, "the first person in quite a long time who treated me like a colleague." He paused. "And the only one who didn't ask about the scar." She had been not asking about the scar for 24 hours and was moderately proud of this restraint. She maintained it now, and something about that decision registered in his face, the smallest loosening around the jaw. "Philadelphia," she said instead, not a question, an invitation. He accepted it. The firm's name had been Cavender and Associates. Holloway had been a junior partner, not a founding partner, but close enough to the inside that he knew where the books were kept and what they said. His direct partner, a man named Ellison, was the one who'd been routing claims. Vane was the Western connection. He had land interests, political contacts, and the ability to register fraudulent documentation in territorial land offices that didn't have the resources to verify everything that came across the desk. When Holloway found the discrepancies, he'd gone to the senior partner first. The senior partner had given him 3 days to reconsider what he thought he'd found. When Holloway came back and said he was certain, 2 things happened within a week. Reports he'd filed were misfiled into irrelevance. And 4 men visited him in his apartment one evening to explain, in physical terms, why the matter was closed. He touched the scar without appearing to realize he was doing it. Adelaide watched his hand and said nothing. He'd left Philadelphia with what he could carry, and the knowledge of the formation's location he'd encountered early indications of it during a legitimate survey 2 years before, and had filed nothing on it at time, waiting until he understood what it was. The mountains were somewhere Ellison and Vane's reach didn't easily extend. He'd come west. He'd found the formation. He'd needed clean documentation and had found Horace Wren. The rest she knew. "You built all of this yourself," she said, meaning the lodge. "The whole thing. First winter was in a trapper's cabin half a mile east." Barely standing. He looked around the room with an expression she was beginning to read, not pride exactly, more like the particular satisfaction of a problem thoroughly solved. "I had time. I had materials. I had the engineering knowledge." "You had books," she said, looking at the walls. "I had books," he agreed. And that was as close to warmth as his voice had gotten in the conversation, which she noted. The next 2 weeks were a kind of education Adelaide had not been trained for and could not have described to anyone who asked. She learned to move in heavy winter conditions not gracefully, but effectively, which Holloway made clear was the distinction that mattered. She learned to read the snow for what it was hiding. Ice underneath a powder surface, unstable crust over a gap, a specific texture that meant an animal had recently passed through. She learned to navigate by terrain features in conditions where visibility dropped to nothing. using the angle of slope and the direction of wind-shaped drifts as reference points. She also continued to learn the rifle. By the end of the first week, she could hit the target rock reliably at 20 yards. By the end of the second, she was consistent at 40, and Holloway had moved to a larger rock further out without telling her he was doing it, which she noticed and didn't mention, which he noticed and also didn't mention. Their conversations evolved the way conversations do between people who spend significant time in close quarters and cannot avoid each other without going outside in a blizzard, gradually, incrementally, with occasional reversals. She found out he read widely and without particular focus engineering texts alongside natural history, philosophy mixed in with geology, a 3-year-old newspaper kept because it had a piece on bridge construction in Pennsylvania that he'd referenced twice. She found out that he had opinions about structural theory that were considerably more developed than his opinions about human beings, and that this was probably not accidental. He found out that she had been educated by her father, not a school that Horace Wren had taught her mathematics and surveying principles and natural science with the same seriousness he brought to his professional work, and had added literature and history because he believed a person without context for the past was flying without instruments. He found out that she had opinions that she had not previously had cause to express because the town of Frostbreak had not been particularly interested in the opinions of Horace Wren's daughter about anything more substantial than how she set a table. "You're angry," he said, one evening, when she had said something about Frostbreak that came out sharper than the words themselves explained. "About several things," she said. "In what order would you like them?" "About your father," he said, not unkindly. She was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about all the things I don't know," she said. "Things he knew and carried alone. I didn't know about Denver. I didn't know about you or the formation or any of it. I thought I knew him completely. You probably knew him better than anyone," Holloway said. "That doesn't mean you knew everything. It's not the same." "No," he said, "it's not." She looked at the fire. "He should have told me," she said. "He was trying to protect you." "I know." She turned the mug in her hands. "That's the part that makes it complicated. He wasn't wrong to be careful. He was right that knowing put people in danger. He proved it." She stopped. "He proved it." Holloway said nothing. He let it sit. That was one of the things about him that she was learning to recognize. He knew when silence was the response, and he used it without discomfort. Most people, she'd found, couldn't tolerate the silence after something heavy was said. They filled it immediately, reflexively, with reassurance or deflection, or the awkward scaffolding of sympathy. Holloway let the heavy things be heavy. It was, she thought, one of the better things about him. There were others. She was cataloging them without fully intending to. On the 11th day, she finally hit the large rock at 60 yards. She lowered the rifle, and her hands were shaking from cold and from the sustained concentration of it. And she stood there in the snow with the ringing in her ears and looked at the rock. And then she turned around, and Holloway was watching from the lodge door. And she held up her hand, not triumphant, just acknowledgement. "Look," he nodded once. That was it. That was the extent of the celebration. She found it sufficient in a way that surprised her. On the 13th day, they worked on the gulch. The preparation was technical in ways Adelaide found she could follow, but couldn't execute the placement of charges required engineering knowledge she didn't have. And Holloway was precise and methodical about it in a way that did not leave room for error. She carried things, held things, handed things. Listened to explanations that she stored with the attention she'd given to her father's field instructions for 2 decades. "The sequence matters as much as the placement," he said, crouched in the narrow shadow of the gulch wall, running wire in a pattern that meant something specific to him. "You don't want simultaneous detonation. You want the first charge to direct the second, and the second to shape what happens with the third. Like an argument," she said, each point setting up the next. He looked up at her. "Something like that," he said. Charges were set by midday. He showed her the firing mechanism, showed her twice, then had her walk through it herself slowly, verbally narrating each step while he watched. She made one error, caught herself, corrected it. He said nothing about the error. He only nodded when she finished, Then they built the secondary position, the place from which someone could monitor the Eastern Pass approach and, if necessary, fire to delay. It was not elaborate. A low wall of packed snow and stone, angled for visibility, with clear sight lines down the approach in a position that wasn't exposed from the gulch side. She helped build it with her hands. In the cold, her hands hurt, and she built it anyway. And when they were done, she stood behind it and looked down the pass and tried to make herself understand what it would feel like with men coming up it. She couldn't fully imagine it yet. She knew she couldn't. "Have you done this before?" she said. "Used terrain this way against people." He was quiet for a moment. "War," he said. She looked at him. "You were in the war," she said. "Engineering Corps," he said. "Union." He looked down the pass. "Different terrain. Principles. You use what the ground gives you, and you don't waste anything. And you stay colder than the situation is pushing you to feel. Because feeling it while it's happening is how you make mistakes." She absorbed this. "You've had a complicated life," she said. Something happened at the edges of his expression, something she hadn't seen yet, or hadn't seen clearly. Almost a real smile, not the not-quite version she'd been cataloging. Something that reached his eyes briefly, and then pulled back. "So has yours," he said, "recent complications aside." She looked at him. "Recent complications," she said. "Is that what you're calling this? What would you call it?" She thought about it. "An education," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and the not-quite smile came back. They walked back to the lodge through the early dusk. The sky had gone purple-gray in the way Wyoming skies do in November, like a bruise healing across the horizon, and the snow reflected what light remained in a way that made the whole mountain feel lit from below. She walked beside him for the first time she'd been following him since the first night, a pace behind. But the trail was wide enough here, and she walked beside him without making a decision about it. He noticed. He didn't say anything. She noticed that he noticed. It was on the 15th day that Silas Creed arrived. She heard the horse before she saw anything not the usual sounds the mountain made, which she had learned to distinguish from the sounds it didn't make, but something labored and irregular. The gait of a horse pushing through deep snow with someone who wasn't directing it well. She was at the firing position, going through the rifle sequence for the 4th time that morning, in the particular cold of a clear day after a fresh snowfall, and she heard it, and she turned, and she called back to the lodge. Holloway came out with his rifle already in hand. They stood and watched the eastern tree line. The horse came out of the trees at an angle that made no tactical sense, and immediately told her that whoever was on it was not concerned with tactical sense. The figure in the saddle was slumped forward in a way that was not riding posture. The horse walked 3 more paces and stopped, as if it had decided that this was far enough, and whatever happened next was someone else's problem. "Stay here," Holloway said. He went forward. She did not stay there. She came up behind him, 2 paces back, rifle ready, watching the tree line for anything that might follow the horse out of it. Nothing came. The sky was empty, the trees were still, and the only movement was the horse's breath in clouds of vapor, and the slow rise and fall of the figure on its back. Holloway reached up and got his hand on the man's collar before he fell, which he was clearly about to do. He lowered him, and it was a him. She could see now, roughly her age or younger, wearing a deputy's badge on a coat that had a dark stain spreading below the left side of his ribcage. He was barely conscious. He had dark red on his teeth when he tried to speak. Holloway got him off the horse and didn't put him in the snow. He took his weight, all of it, and said to Adelaide without looking at her, "At the door." She got the door. They got him inside. Holloway put him on the floor near the fire, which was the warmest spot, and he was efficient and not gentle about it, in the way that emergency care is not gentle necessary before kind. He was already pulling the coat away to look at what was underneath. Adelaide had seen injuries, not gunshot injuries, but she'd grown up in a territory where men worked with dangerous equipment and distant medical attention, and she did not flinch from blood as a general principle. She looked at the wound, which was bad, not unsurvivable, maybe, but bad, and she looked at Holloway's face, which was reading it the way he read everything else, fast and without drama. "You know what you're doing," she said. It wasn't a question. "War," he said again. "Right. She did what he told her to do, which was to get specific things from specific shelves, and she did it without wasting time asking which thing he meant when he could have meant two things, because context made it clear and asking would slow them down. He worked and she worked alongside him, and the man on the floor made sounds that she did not let herself respond to emotionally because there would be time for that later. Eventually, the man's breathing steadied. His color was still wrong, but it was less wrong than it had been 20 minutes before. Holloway sat back on his heels. "He'll last the night," he said. "Probably more." Adelaide looked at the deputy's badge. "Who is he?" she said. "Silas Creed," Holloway said. "He's been the only deputy in Frostbreak who didn't work directly for Vane." Which means Vane found out," she said. Holloway nodded. As if to confirm the point, the man on the floor opened his eyes. They were dark and glassy, with pain and fever starting. But they were open, and they were finding things to focus on the ceiling. Then the fire. Then Holloway. Then Adelaide. "Holloway," he said. His voice was barely there. "He knows." "Tell me," Holloway said. Creed wet his lips. It cost him something visible. "Found out about the claim. Someone in Denver talked. He stopped, breathed, started again. He's already put men on the passes. Watching. Not moving yet, but another stop. There were more men riding into town 3 days ago. I counted 20, maybe more, hired." He looked at Holloway. "He's coming up soon. He said I heard him. He said he wanted it done before the federal survey, and that's 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Adelaide said and looked at Holloway. Creed's eyes moved to her. He didn't recognize her. Clearly he was searching his memory for a context that didn't have her in it. "Adelaide Wren," she said. "Horace's daughter." Something crossed his face. "You should know," he said, "about your father. I've got evidence. Letters. Took them from Vane's office 6 weeks ago. When I first started, I wasn't sure what—" He closed his eyes for a moment. "Inside pocket. Didn't trust anywhere in town." Holloway reached inside the man's coat carefully and produced a folded packet, thick with papers, held with twine. He handed it to Adelaide. She untied the twine, unfolded the outer paper. The first letter was in a handwriting she recognized not her father's. Vane's, which she'd seen on the debt ledger he'd produced in the saloon. It was addressed to someone named Garrett, with a territorial government address in the heading. It discussed Horace Wren by name. It discussed the timing of what it called an arrangement. It discussed a creek crossing on a specific trail. The trail her father had ridden 100 times without incident. Adelaide stood with the letters in her hands and the fire burning beside her, and the wounded deputy breathing on the floor, and the mountain pressed in around the lodge on all sides with its cold, enormous weight, and she stood very still. Holloway watched her. She refolded the letters carefully, tied the twine, set the packet on the map table. When she spoke, her voice was level. "He sent the letters," she said. "The arrangement. My father's, he wrote it down. He documented it." She looked at Holloway. "He documented his own crime. Men like Vane document everything," Holloway said, "because they're certain they'll never be held accountable." Adelaide looked at the packet on the table. "He was wrong about that," she said. Creed had fallen unconscious again. His breathing was still going, which was what mattered. The fire was burning. Outside, the mountain was quiet, the way a mountain is quiet before something uses it, before the wind picks up or the snow shifts or something large moves through the trees with intent. Somewhere on the eastern pass, Vane's men were watching. Adelaide looked at the map on the table. At the marked positions, the calculated distances, the small, precise annotations in Holloway's handwriting that laid out the logic of what 2 people might do against 20 if they used the ground correctly and didn't make mistakes. She looked at Holloway. "How long do we have?" she said. He looked at the map. He looked at the window, reading something in the sky she couldn't yet interpret. 3 days, he said. 4 if the weather turns. She nodded once. She picked up the rifle and began checking the mechanism again, not because she didn't trust it, but because this was now something she did when she needed to think and think clearly, and have something in her hands that reminded her what thinking clearly was for. Holloway watched her for a moment. Then he sat down at the map table and picked up the pencil, and they began to work. 3 days turned into 2. Holloway found the first sign on the morning of the second day boot prints in the snow at the edge of the eastern tree line. Not Creed's, not old enough to be anything but recent. 2 men, maybe 3, moving slowly and returning the same way they came. Scouts. Vane was measuring the approach before he committed to it, which meant he was being careful, which meant he was taking this seriously, which meant whatever advantage surprise might have offered was gone. Holloway came back to the lodge and stood at the work table without taking his coat off and looked at the map for about 45 seconds. Then he moved 2 things, repositioned a notation near the eastern choke point, and added a mark that hadn't been there before, near the northern tree line where the terrain dropped sharply before leveling into the approach corridor. Adelaide watched him from across the room. "They were up here last night," she said. "Yes, while we were sleeping, yes." She let that settle. It was not a comfortable thing to settle. Creed was awake and propped against the lodge's interior wall with a folded blanket behind his back. He'd been drifting in and out. For 2 days, the wound was not going to kill him if he stayed still, and the fever stayed manageable, and Holloway had been precise and relentless about both conditions. He looked like a man who had argued with the end of his life and reached a provisional disagreement, which was about the best available description. "How many did you say?" Holloway said to him. Not for the first time. 20 I counted, Creed said. His voice had come back to about half its normal volume. There were more coming in, riders I didn't recognize. He's been pulling them from somewhere, not just local hired men. These were different. Professional, Holloway said. Some of them. Adelaide looked at the map. 20 men, possibly more. 2 people and a wounded deputy who could not walk to his horse without assistance. 3 days of preparation in a frozen mountain valley. She ran the arithmetic the way her father had taught her to run any calculation, not to the answer she wanted, but to the answer the numbers actually produced. The numbers produced something uncomfortable. "Tell me the honest version," she said to Holloway. He looked at her. Of what? Of whether this works. The gulch charges, the positions, all of it. What does it actually accomplish against that many men? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding between versions. "The gulch eliminates the western approach," he said. "That's real. They come through the eastern pass, which is narrower and longer, and they come through it slowly because the terrain won't allow speed. The first choke point can be held by one person long enough for the other to reposition. The second position covers the approach to the lodge." He paused. "We can reduce their numbers significantly if the charges work as designed. We can make the approach expensive enough that some of them reconsider, but we can't stop all of them," she said. "No. So at some point they reach the lodge." "At some point, some of them reach the lodge," he said, with the emphasis on some of them carrying all the weight it needed to carry. Adelaide looked at the door. "Then we make the lodge the last position," she said. Creed made a sound from against the wall, not a word, more like the sound a person makes when they want to say something and don't have the breath for it yet. Both of them looked at him. "The letters," he said. "If it goes wrong, the letters need to get out. Whatever happens up here, if those letters reach the federal land office in Cheyenne, Vane is finished regardless." He looked at Holloway. "There's a man in Cheyenne. Name's Alderman. Federal land surveyor, old guard, been there 20 years and nobody's bought him." Horace knew him. Adelaide's attention sharpened. "My father knew him," she said. "Corresponded with him. I found the letters in Vane's files. He'd been monitoring your father's mail." Alderman had been writing to Horace about irregularities he'd noticed in territorial land filings. He was already looking. Creed stopped, breathed, continued. "If someone reaches Alderman with what's in that packet and with the deed, Vane's entire network comes apart. Not just him, everyone he's been working with." Holloway looked at Adelaide. She looked at the packet of letters on the map table. Then at the deed, still folded on the chair arm where she'd placed it the first night, which now felt like something that happened in a different season of her life. "We need to copy the deed," she said, and the key letters. Multiple copies, different locations. She was already moving to the work table, looking for paper. If they take the lodge, they might find one copy. They won't find all of them. Holloway watched her for a moment. Then he opened the drawer beneath the work table and put a stack of paper on the surface and sat down across from her. And they spent 3 hours copying documents by firelight her in the clear, educated hand her father had insisted upon. Him and the technical precision of an engineer who had drafted contracts and reports for a Philadelphia firm that had taught him, among other things, that documents were their own kind of weapon. Creed slept through most of it. By evening, they had 4 copies of the essential materials. Holloway sealed 2 of them in oilskin and placed them in locations he didn't specify to Adelaide, which she understood was intentional. What she didn't know, she couldn't reveal under pressure. She took the same approach with the 3rd copy, choosing a location in the back room that she didn't mention to him. The original deed she kept on her person, inside her coat, against the warmth of her body. It was, she thought, the most unconventional thing she had ever carried next to her skin. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the back room, listening to the sounds of the lodge, the fire settling, Creed's breathing from the main room, the distant moan of wind around the rock face above. She lay there, and she thought about her father, about Horace Wren making 2 trips to Denver over 18 months, telling her he was visiting a cousin, coming home with mud on his boots and something in his eyes that she had read as professional satisfaction and now understood was something more complicated. Fear, maybe, the particular kind that a decent man carries when he's done something right that might get him killed and has decided to do it anyway. He had known what Vane was. He had known, and he had helped anyway. And he had put her name on the deed because he believed she could carry it. And then he had died on a trail he knew like his own hands. And she had spent 4 months believing it was an accident. She got up before dawn. She went to the main room, stirred the fire, and stood with her back to it. Holloway was asleep in his chair, not the back room. He'd never once used the back room since she'd been here, she realized, which meant he'd given it to her entirely, and been sleeping in the chair since the first night and had not mentioned this, because it was not something he would mention. She stood there and looked at him in the dim firelight, and thought about what kind of man does that without making it a point. He opened his eyes, not gradually all at once, the way soldiers open their eyes, fully present between 1 second and the next. "What time?" he said. "Early," she said. "Go back to sleep." He looked at her for a moment. "You should sleep," he said. "I know." He didn't push it. He closed his eyes again, though she wasn't certain he went back to sleep. She stood by the fire for another hour, and then she went back to the room and lay down and stared at the ceiling. And eventually the ceiling got light, and it was morning, and the day they'd been preparing for was measurably closer. It came on the 4th morning. It came the way Holloway had said it would before full light, using the dark and the cold as cover, moving down the eastern pass in a column that the terrain forced into a narrow line. Adelaide heard them before she could see anything, the creak of tack and the muffled displacement of horses in snow, sounds the mountain absorbed but didn't eliminate entirely. She was already at the secondary position. Holloway was at the gulch. They'd said goodbye. It wasn't a word either of them used, but that's what it was at the lodge door 40 minutes earlier. He'd checked the rifle mechanism one final time, not because it needed checking, but because his hands needed to do it. She'd let him. "Don't fire from cover until you're certain of the shot," he'd said. "If you're not certain, don't fire. Delay is better than a miss that reveals your position." "I know," she said. "The back door of the lodge is not locked." "I know, Adelaide." She'd looked at him directly. "I know what to do," she said. "Do what you need to do on the gulch side." He'd looked at her for one long moment in the cold dark. "Your father was right," he said, "about what you were capable of." She hadn't been able to say anything to that, which was unusual for her, and she'd turned and walked to her position before the feeling in her chest could become something she couldn't manage. Now she was behind the low wall of snow and rock with the rifle across the top of it, and she was watching the dark shape of the eastern pass, and she was breathing the way Holloway had taught her, slow out, steady. Don't hold it. Keep the shoulders down. The cold was the kind that made your eyes water even when you weren't crying, and she was not crying, though the distinction felt momentarily academic. The column came into the pass. She could see them now, dark shapes against the snow, moving in the loose formation of men who knew there might be opposition, but hadn't decided to be afraid of it yet. They were spread as much as the terrain allowed. Someone at the front of the column was directing with hand signals she could see but not interpret. she counted. 14 visible, possibly more behind the tree line. She had one job right now: watch the position, slow the approach, protect the eastern flank while Holloway worked the gulch. She did not fire. Not yet. The range was still too great for the kind of certainty he'd described, and the wall gave her concealment as long as she didn't announce herself. The column was perhaps 300 yards from the lodge when the western gulch exploded. It was not a sound she had prepared herself for adequately. She'd been present for the charge placement. She'd been present for the testing of the mechanism. She understood intellectually that 3 precisely sequenced charges in a narrow rock corridor would produce significant noise and displacement. The intellectual understanding turned out to be approximately 30% of the reality. The sound was enormous. The snow from the ridge above the gulch dropped in a single mass, a white avalanche, filling the corridor in roughly 4 seconds. The ground shook. She felt it through her knees and through the stone beneath the snow wall. Birds she hadn't known were in the trees above, erupted from them in a ragged black cloud. The column in the eastern pass stopped. For about 2 seconds they were entirely still, every man and horse in that column locked by the sound and the sensation. Then several things happened at once. The column broke into something more ragged as men tried to spread out. Horses moved sideways, and some handlers couldn't hold them. The organized forward movement became a complicated and less organized middle-distance confusion, and in the middle of it, Holloway emerged from the forest on the western edge of the valley and was firing with a precision she could track even from her distance, not wildly, not with the suppressive logic of volume, but specific single shots directed at specific targets, with the patience of someone who knew exactly how many rounds he had and what each one needed to accomplish. She fired. Her first shot was wide. She knew it when she pulled, felt the slight lateral deviation that meant her breath had caught. She worked the reload with cold hands that were better at it than they'd been 3 weeks ago, nowhere near as good as they needed to be, and she fired again. The second shot was not wide. A man in the column went down. She felt something she had not expected, not satisfaction exactly. More like the terrifying confirmation that this was real. This was actually happening. This was not the abstract tactical map on the work table, but bodies in the snow. She had a moment where everything she was doing felt profoundly wrong and simultaneously completely necessary. And these two things existed at the same time and didn't resolve. And she pulled the next round in and kept firing because there was nothing else to do. Holloway had said, "Delay is the objective. Make them pay for every yard. Don't let them move freely." She made them pay for yards. The first phase lasted approximately 20 minutes. By the end of it, the column had lost 4 men, and the organized approach had been disrupted into something messier: men working in smaller groups, using terrain for cover, moving more carefully, which was slower, which was the point. Then they regrouped. They regrouped because they had enough men that losing 4 didn't break them, and because whoever was directing them was not incompetent, and because Holloway had been right that delay was the objective rather than stopping them entirely. She watched them find a flanking angle on her position, and she understood about 15 seconds before it became urgent that the secondary wall was about to be less useful than it had been. She moved. She moved without standing fully upright, using the contour of the snow-covered ground, going toward the lodge at a crouch that her knees were already complaining about, and she was telling her knees to manage their complaints on their own time. A shot came from somewhere in the column and hit the snow wall behind her. She heard it, felt the spray of displaced snow, kept moving. She made the lodge. She came through the front door low and fast, the way Holloway had shown her, not standing in the frame, through it and to the side immediately. And Creed was still against the wall, and he had a pistol in his hand that he lowered when he saw it was her. "Gulch is gone," she said. "They're through the eastern pass." Holloway, still out there, Creed tried to stand. His face told a full story about what that attempt cost him. "Stay," she said. "You cannot help out there, and you know it." "I can cover the window," she said, and he stopped trying to stand and shifted position to get an angle on the south window, which was the direction they'd eventually come from, if they pushed all the way to the lodge. And she went to the east window, which she had learned to use in the preceding weeks, Because Holloway had made her learn to use every window in the building against the possibility of exactly this. The next 40 minutes were the worst 40 minutes of her life. She was aware, in a disconnected way, that this statement might not fully hold up under examination later. There had been other candidates. Standing in the broken spur with Vane's hand on her wrist. The moment Holloway had said the word no in response to her question about her father's horse. Reading Vane's letter with the reference to the trail and the creek crossing. Those had each been, in their way, the worst moment of something. This was different because it was ongoing. The others had been singular impacts. This was sustained pressure, the sound of firing from outside. The inability to know what any specific sound meant. Creed's controlled breathing from across the room. The specific effort of watching her window and making herself not watch the door. Because the door was not her position, and covering what she was supposed to cover was the only way any of this had any logic at all. She fired 4 times through the east window. She hit her target twice, which she knew. She didn't know about the other 2. Holloway was in the trees. She could track his position by the sound of his rifle, distinctive from the multiple weapons on the other side, its particular deep report. He was moving. He'd said he would move, never fire twice from the same position, make them calculate a moving target, spend their attention on location rather than advance. She tracked his sound, and she managed her window, and she and Creed didn't talk, because there was nothing to say. And sound discipline was the only kind of discipline available. Then she heard something she hadn't anticipated, not from outside. From the back of the lodge, she looked at Creed. He'd heard it too. His eyes had moved to the interior wall. The back room window, she'd known it was a vulnerability. They'd discussed it. Holloway had reinforced the shutter with a brace, but a brace was only wood, and wood was only wood. She went to the back room. She came through the door 2 seconds before the window shutter gave way. The man who came through the window was not large, but he was fast. He dropped into the room and was already bringing his pistol up, and she was already bringing the rifle up, and the distance between them was 9 feet, which was too close for the rifle, but she swung it rather than aimed it, the heavy barrel in a horizontal arc that caught his pistol hand before his gun was fully oriented. The pistol discharged into the floor. She drove the rifle barrel into his sternum, and he went back into the wall, and she was not thinking. She was not thinking at all. She had gone somewhere below thought, to the place where the body runs on what it has been taught, and prayer and luck are both irrelevant. She hit him again. He went down. She stood over him in the small back room, with the window gaping open and cold air screaming through it, and she was breathing in the way that happens below the level you can control. And she stood there until her breathing regulated, and then she went back to the main room. Creed looked at her. "There's someone in the back," she said. "I heard," he said. She reloaded. Sometime in the next hour the lodge was reached. She had known it would be. Holloway had said it would be. That had always been the plan's honest acknowledgement of itself, not that the lodge would never be breached, but that by the time it was breached, the numbers on the other side would be different from what they'd started with. The numbers on the other side were indeed different. She didn't know exactly how different. She had lost the external tactical picture somewhere in the chaos of the back room and the sustained window defense, and she was operating entirely on what she could see from her own position. She knew there were fewer of them. She knew Holloway was still moving, still firing, because she could still track his rifle's voice in the noise. She did not know for about 20 minutes where Creed was. He had shifted position at some point from the south window to somewhere she couldn't see from where she was. She called his name once, low, and got no answer, and she made herself not interpret that yet, because interpretation required facts, and she didn't have them. Then she heard him. From near the south wall, not a voice, a sound, a single sharp inhalation, and then quiet. She went to him. He was on the floor. He'd been hit again the same side as before, which was the side that had already been doing badly. The pistol was still in his hand. There were 2 empty cartridges on the floor beside him that he'd managed to fire, which meant he'd accomplished something before this happened. And she noted that with a clarity that she would only later understand was her mind giving itself manageable things to focus on. "Creed," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were clear. which was surprising, and then wasn't some people go clear at the end of things. She'd heard this. She'd never seen it, and now she was seeing it. Letters, he said. I have them, Alderman. I know, she said. I know about Alderman. We'll get them to him. He looked at her for a moment. You're not, he said slowly, what I expected Horace Wren's daughter to be. She put her hand on his arm. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing that didn't sound wrong. That's a compliment, he said. And then the clarity in his eyes shifted into something else, something quieter, and Silas Creed, who had been the only deputy in Frostbreak who didn't work for Rufus Vane, who had spent 6 weeks stealing letters from Vane's office at personal risk and carried them up a mountain in his coat, died with his pistol still in his hand and the fire still burning 10 feet away. Adelaide stayed there for approximately 30 seconds. Then she stood up. She was out of rifle ammunition. She took Creed's pistol. She went back to the window and looked at what was outside. There were 3 men visible between the tree line and the lodge. She could see signs of at least 2 more in the trees themselves. Compared to the 20 that had entered the eastern pass, this was a different arithmetic, but 3 men between her and the tree line, with the pistol Creed had been carrying, and whatever she had in terms of nerve was still a problem that did not have a clean solution. Then the rifle sound stopped. Not the others, the multiple weapons from Vane's men. Those continued sporadically. But the distinctive single voice she'd been tracking for the last hour, the one that moved and relocated and never repeated itself, that one stopped. Her stomach dropped. She stood at the window and she waited, and she listened, and she made herself not catastrophize, made herself simply collect information. Because Holloway had said that fear is noise and noise costs time and time costs lives. And she was choosing to believe he had said it because it was true and not because it was useful. 30 seconds of silence. Then she heard him, not his rifle. His voice, and it was outside, not far, and she could hear what was being said. It's over, Holloway. Look at what's left of your little arrangement. Vane. Vane was at the tree line. She went to the south window, not the east. The south, which had the angle on the tree line, and she looked through it, and she could see them. Holloway was at the base of a pine tree, sitting against it in a way that was not a chosen posture. He was holding his side. His rifle was on the ground, the wrong distance from his hand. 3 of Vane's men stood between him and any approach to it. Vane walked toward him in the snow with the same unhurried quality he'd had in the broken spur, the same calculation, his done certainty of a man who believes the last piece has moved to where he wanted it. She watched Vane crouch down to Holloway's level, oddly intimate, that gesture. 2 men who had been enemies for a decade, reduced to this proximity by the specific geography of a mountain valley and whatever was wrong with Holloway's side. The deed, Vane said. She couldn't hear it, but she read the shape of it. The girl, the gold, all of it. Holloway said something she couldn't read. Vane stood back up. He pulled his revolver and held it without urgency. Everything you built up here, Vane said, loud enough now that she could hear the words through the window glass, belongs to me now. Everything your dead friend Horace documented. The girl, too, when we find her. He looked at the lodge. And we will find her. Adelaide stepped back from the window. She looked at Creed on the floor, at the empty rifle in her hands. At the pistol, checked the load, which she'd already checked, which she checked again anyway, because her hands needed something to do. She looked at the deed against her ribs. She looked at the fire, still burning, because Holloway built fires that lasted. She thought about her father making 2 trips to Denver over 18 months. She thought about what he believed she was capable of. She picked up the buffalo rifle. It was empty. She knew it was empty. But there was one thing the empty rifle gave her that the pistol didn't, and that was range, and the appearance of something that could be done from range. And Vane was 30 yards from the south window, which was the distance at which she'd proven the large rock was not safe. She went to the south door. She opened it. She stepped out into the cold with the buffalo rifle at her shoulder and the pistol at her hip and walked out into the November light. Vane heard her before he saw her. The men between her and Holloway turned. Dane turned. He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. It was the same laugh he'd used in the broken spur. The one that assumed she was performing something that would eventually exhaust itself. The laugh of a man who had spent decades using the predictability of other people's limits against them, who had learned so thoroughly that limits existed that he had stopped examining the assumption. Adelaide Wren, he said, put that down before you hurt yourself. She kept the rifle at her shoulder. Her footing was on packed snow, and the cold was the kind that made your face numb, and the rifle weighed what it weighed, which was considerable. But the weight was familiar now, and her shoulder had developed a specific tolerance for it over the past 3 weeks. You wrote a letter, she said. He tilted his head. The revolver was still in his hand, but not raised not yet. You wrote a letter to a man named Garrett, she said, about a trail crossing and a timing arrangement. You used the word arrangement. Her voice was level. She was breathing slowly. You documented it, because men like you document everything, because you're certain you'll never be held accountable. Something changed in his expression. The laugh faded. We have copies, she said. Not one, multiple, in multiple locations. With a name in Cheyenne who was already looking at your filings before today, and who now has enough to dismantle everything you've built for the past 20 years. She watched his face. You can kill us both on this mountain, and it won't matter. The letters are already in motion. This last part was not strictly true in a logistical sense. But it was true in the sense that mattered. The intent was in motion, the copies existed, and Alderman in Cheyenne was a real name that she could see landing in Vane's calculations by the way his face adjusted when she said it. You're bluffing, he said. You taught my father about careful versus sorry, she said. He taught me. Vane raised the revolver. Adelaide steadied her breath exactly the way she'd been taught. Let the cold air all the way out. Felt the trigger's resistance under her finger. 40 yards. She'd hit the rock at 60. Vane told her she didn't have the courage. She fired. The empty rifle produced no discharge. What it produced was the most committed full-extension firing posture he'd ever seen on a woman holding what he believed to be a loaded weapon. And the half-second that cost him was the half-second in which Adelaide dropped the rifle, drew Creed's pistol from her hip, and fired from 9 yards closer than she'd been a moment ago, in the same motion, without breaking her breath. The shot took Rufus Vane in the right shoulder and spun him backward into the snow. The revolver went one direction. Vane went another. For a full 3 seconds, nothing moved. Not the men between her and Holloway, not the shapes in the tree line, not the smoke from the lodge behind her. Then Holloway's voice from the base of the pine tree. Drop them, he said. He had his rifle. She didn't know how she'd thought it was out of reach, and he was wounded, and it shouldn't have been possible. But he had it, and his voice carried the quality it always carried, which was the quality of something that doesn't need volume to mean business. The men dropped their weapons. Vane was alive. She could hear him. The shoulder wound was not fatal, which she had intended. She'd aimed for the shoulder. She'd thought about what she was doing. This was not an accident or luck, but a specific decision she'd made somewhere between the south door and the moment she pulled the trigger. She had not wanted him dead. She wanted him in a federal land court with his letters entered as evidence and aldermen from Cheyenne reading every word aloud to people who had the authority to act on what they heard. She walked to Holloway. He was not well. The wound in his side was the kind that needed attention and rest and time, none of which had been recently available. He was upright against the pine tree, and his color was wrong, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. The rifle was empty, he said. I know, she said. You drew him in range of the pistol. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Horace, he said, definitely wasn't wrong. She got her arm under his, and he was heavy, enormously heavy. The weight of a large man, with no current intention of pretending to need less help than he needed, and she took it, and they stood there in the cold of the valley, with the smoke rising from the lodge, and Vane's men standing with their hands visible. And Vane himself making sounds in the snow that told her he was going to survive and face what was coming. The mountain was quiet again. The particular quiet of aftermath, which is different from the quiet of before denser, with things in it, all the things that happened pressing against the silence that follows. Adelaide stood in it with Bram Holloway's weight against her, and the deed against her ribs and Creed's pistol still in her hand, and she looked at the valley, and she looked at the passes, and she looked at the sky going gray with afternoon coming in over the ridge. She did not feel victorious. She felt like a person who had done a series of things that needed doing and was now standing on the other side of them, still upright, which was the criteria she had set for herself somewhere in the previous 3 weeks and which she had met. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. The first thing Adelaide did after the shooting stopped was deal with the immediate problems in order of urgency, because that was what the situation required, and because falling apart was something she could schedule for later when there was no one depending on her to remain functional. Holloway needed the wound in his side addressed before the cold finished what the bullet had started. The surviving men from Vane's hired group, 7 of them still standing, 3 more with injuries that weren't fatal, needed to be disarmed completely and secured in a way that 1 wounded man and 1 exhausted woman could actually maintain. Vane himself needed the shoulder wound stabilized, not because Adelaide had any particular interest in his comfort, but because a dead Rufus Vane was a problem she didn't need. A dead Rufus Vane couldn't stand in front of a federal judge. A dead Rufus Vane became a story that could be rewritten by the people who'd benefited from him, and she had spent enough of her life watching men like that rewrite stories to their own advantage. She needed him alive, and she needed him to answer for things, and those 2 requirements shaped every decision she made in the hour after the firing stopped. She got Holloway inside first. This was not a graceful operation. He was large and wounded and stubborn about how much assistance he was willing to accept, which she addressed by ignoring his stubbornness entirely and putting her shoulder under his arm and walking him toward the lodge door with the focused practicality she'd developed over the past 3 weeks for tasks that were physically demanding and emotionally inconvenient. He said once that he could manage, and she said nothing at all in response, which he accepted. Inside, she sat him in his chair by the fire and looked at the wound. It was a through and through below the ribs on his left side, which was better than it could have been and worse than nothing. The bleeding was not catastrophic, but it was consistent, and it needed to stop. She had watched him work on Creed. She had paid attention. She did what she'd watched him do, with the materials she'd watched him use, and her hands shook slightly for the first part of it and steadied as she worked because shaking hands are a luxury, and she was not in a position to afford luxuries. Holloway said nothing through any of it, which she appreciated more than she could have expressed. He watched her face while she worked, not his own wound, which told her something she stored without examining. "It's going to need better attention than this," she said, tying the last wrap. "I know. When the passes clear, we need to get you to an actual doctor. The passes will clear in a week if the weather holds. Then you're going to spend a week doing what I tell you to do," she said. He looked at her. "That's a significant amount of power," he said. "You can take it up with me when you're not bleeding," she said. She went back outside. The 7 standing men were where she'd left them. She had told them to sit in the snow with their hands visible, which was not a comfortable instruction, but they had complied with it in the way that men comply with instructions when the situation has recently, and definitively demonstrated that the person giving instructions knows what they're doing. She looked at them for a moment, assessing. They were hired men. She could see it in the way they looked at her, not with the particular invested hatred she'd have expected from men who had a personal stake in this, but with a more neutral wariness. They had been paid to come up a mountain and do a job, and the job had not gone the way the person who paid them had described, and their current posture said they were receptive to information about what happened next. "Listen to me carefully," she said. "What happens to you depends entirely on what you do in the next 10 minutes. If you were hired by Vane and your association with him ends here, that is information I can bring to the federal authorities when they arrive. If you make yourself useful in the meantime, that is also information I can bring." She paused. "If you give me any reason to change my assessment of the situation, I will address that directly." She held up Creed's pistol. She had reloaded it. "Who's the senior man among you?" she said. A moment of hesitation, and then a man to her left, dark-haired, mid-40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent significant time outdoors, professionally raised his chin slightly. "Name," she said. Marsh, he said. Marsh, I need the wounded secured and Vane's shoulder properly wrapped. I need the horses brought in from where you left them before they freeze. And I need the back room window repaired with whatever materials you can find in the outbuildings. She looked at him directly. Can you organize that? He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was working through several things simultaneously. Yes, ma'am, he said. Don't call me ma'am, she said. It's not who I am at this point. She went back inside and sat down for the first time in what felt like the entire previous week. Creed was still where she'd left him. She had covered him with the blanket from the back room before she went outside, some instinct toward dignity in a situation that had very little room for it. She sat in the second chair, her chair, by now, though neither of them had ever called it that, and she looked at him. She had not known Silas Creed before 4 days ago. She had spoken to him only in fragments, in the spaces between his fever and the immediate demands of preparation, and then the attack itself. But she knew what he'd done. She knew what 6 weeks of stealing letters from Vane's office at personal risk looked like in terms of what it cost a person, because the letters were in her coat and the cost was on the floor in front of her. I'm going to make it mean something, she said quietly, to the room. Holloway heard her. He didn't say anything, but she knew he heard. The next 4 days were their own particular trial. The weather held, which was the only mercy immediately available. Marsh turned out to be competent in the practical sense. He organized the surviving men without complaint, managed the horses, reinforced the window, and maintained a studied neutrality about the entire situation that suggested he had spent his professional life carefully not becoming invested in the internal politics of whoever was currently paying him. He treated Adelaide's authority as a simple fact of the situation, which it was, and he didn't make it complicated, which she was grateful for. Vane was secured in the outbuilding. She went to see him on the second day. She hadn't planned to, or she had planned not to, which is a different thing. She had decided that she had nothing to say to Rufus Vane that would do anyone any good, that the appropriate arena for what she had to say to Rufus Vane was a courtroom with a federal judge and a documented record, and the letters from his own file read aloud in front of witnesses who had the authority to act on them. But she went anyway, alone in the early morning before Holloway was awake, because what she needed to do was something she needed to do without anyone watching her do it. He was sitting against the far wall of the outbuilding with his right arm in the improvised sling Marsh had fashioned, and he looked reduced from what he'd been, not destroyed, not broken, but compressed somehow, as if the large space he'd occupied in her imagination for the past several weeks had turned out to be partly air. He looked up when she came in. She stood in the doorway. He trusted you, she said. My father. He would never have trusted you. He didn't deal in that kind of transaction. But he trusted the law. He trusted that the processes existed for a reason, and that if you documented things correctly and filed them properly in the right places, the record was the record. Vane said nothing. He was right about that, she said. He was just wrong about how long it takes. He didn't live to see it take long enough. She looked at him steadily. You're going to see it. You're going to be there for all of it, which is more than he got. Vane's expression shifted not to remorse. She didn't expect remorse, and she didn't see it. More like calculation re-engaging. The same processing she'd watched in the saloon, trying to find the leverage point, the angle, the offer that would restructure the situation. Whatever you think those letters prove, he started. Don't, she said, not to me, save it for Cheyenne. She left. She walked back to the lodge through the sharp cold of the morning, and she stood outside the door for a moment, with her face up and her eyes closed. The sky above the ridge was the pale blue of deep winter, cloudless, and the air had the kind of absolute clarity that exists only in the mountains at altitude when the storms have passed. She went inside and made coffee that was probably as terrible as Holloway's, and didn't care. On the 5th morning, Holloway was on his feet. Not fully, he was upright in a way that still involved the wall playing a supporting role, and his color remained approximately wrong. And she told him to sit down with a directness that surprised them both, but he was ambulatory, which meant the passes might be achievable. She was looking at the map. If we send Marsh's group down first, she said, with Vane and the wounded under the terms I described. Marsh understands what's in it for him to deliver them to the territorial marshal in Frostbreak instead of letting them scatter. You trust Marsh, Holloway said. He'd sat down, not because she'd told him to, but because the wall had been doing most of the work and the walk from the back room had used up his credit with it. I trust that Marsh is a practical man who has made a calculation about where his interests lie, she said. That's a different thing from trust, and it's enough for this specific purpose. Holloway looked at her for a moment. You've changed how you think about people, he said. She considered this. I've always known that people act in their interests, she said. I think I used to believe that self-interest and decency were usually the same thing for most people. Frostbreak taught me that when they're not the same, people choose interest. She paused. So you build situations where their interest and what you need are aligned. Marsh needs to not be charged as an accomplice. What I need is Vane delivered intact to someone with authority over him. Those two things happen to line up. Your father taught you to survey land, Holloway said. Someone else taught you to survey people. No one taught me, she said. Recent events were instructive. She sent Marsh and his group down on the 6th day. She and Holloway would follow on the 7th, when he'd had one more day, and she'd had time to do what she needed to do inside the lodge before they left it. What she needed to do was sit with Creed. Not in any complicated ceremony. She wasn't built for ceremony, and she suspected Creed wouldn't have wanted it. But she needed to sit in the lodge with what he'd done and understand it properly before the next phase of things began. Because the next phase was going to be loud and procedural and full of people who hadn't been here. And she wanted to carry an accurate account of what had actually happened on this mountain with her into all of that noise. She sat in her chair by the fire. Holloway was at the work table, doing something quiet with the survey documents that she didn't interrupt. Outside, the mountain was doing its particular silence. He said, I wasn't what he expected, she said. Holloway looked up. Creed, she said, at the end, he said I wasn't what he expected Horace Wren's daughter to be. Holloway waited. I don't know if that's because he expected less, she said, or if my father described me a certain way. I'll never know which. She looked at the fire. That bothers me less than it should, I think. What he meant by it was a compliment. I'm going to take the compliment. You should, Holloway said. She looked at him. What did my father tell you about me, she said. Specifically, he set the pen down. He thought for a moment not evasively, but genuinely the way he thought about things he wanted to be accurate about. He said, you were the most practically intelligent person he'd ever taught, Holloway said. He said you had his eye for terrain and your mother's capacity for reading situations. He said he'd made the mistake of assuming that meant you didn't also feel things deeply and that he'd learned he was wrong about that. He paused. He said he should have included you in the Denver matter from the beginning, and that he'd allowed his need to protect you to override his respect for what you were capable of, and that he considered that a personal failure. Adelaide sat very still. He said that to you, she said, 2 months before he died, when he came back from the second Denver trip and amended the deed. She breathed in, breathed out. He never said it to me, she said. I know, Holloway said. I think he was working up to it. She looked at the fire for a long time. The thing she had been carrying since the first night, the cold, angular thing in her chest that had arrived when she understood her father had kept things from her, she could feel it shifting now. Not dissolving, not resolved into something clean and neat, just changing shape, because the thing she'd been carrying wasn't only grief and it wasn't only anger. Some of it was the fear that the keeping from her meant he hadn't seen her clearly, hadn't trusted what she was, and now she knew he had. Too late in the way of many important things, but he had. Thank you, she said. Holloway nodded once. Then he picked up the pen and went back to what he'd been doing, which was the right thing to do, and she sat with the fire until she was ready to be someone going forward rather than someone sitting still. They descended the mountain on the 7th day. Holloway walked under his own authority, which he would have done regardless of medical advice, and Adelaide walked beside him, which had become the natural arrangement somewhere in the previous weeks, without either of them marking the specific moment. The passes were manageable, not comfortable. The snow was still deep, and the wind still found angles you hadn't anticipated, but manageable. which was what the situation required. Frostbreak looked smaller than she remembered. She had been gone 7 weeks. In 7 weeks, she had learned to fire a buffalo rifle, navigate a mountain blizzard, dress a wound, read topographical maps by firelight, hold a firing position against an armed assault, and face Rufus Vane in the snow with an empty gun and walk away from it. The town below, with its saloon and its familiar faces and its careful arithmetic of who it could afford to defend when the stakes were real, the town looked like what it was, a small human arrangement in a large indifferent geography, doing its best, failing at the things that were hard, getting by on the things that were easy. She was not angry at it anymore. She was also not sentimental about it. The territorial marshal's office had 2 messages waiting for them. The first was that Marsh had delivered Vane and the surviving hired men as agreed, and that Vane was currently in custody pending the arrival of federal authorities from Cheyenne, and that the territorial marshal, a man named Tabor, whom Adelaide had met twice and assessed as competent and not purchased, had reviewed the letters and the deed copies, and had sent his own rider to Cheyenne 48 hours ago. The second message was from Alderman himself. He had apparently been sending letters to Frostbreak for 6 weeks that had not arrived that she had not received, and when Marsh's rider reached Cheyenne with the packet, Alderman had understood immediately what had been happening to his correspondence and had sent back a response that was 3 pages of legal and procedural language that essentially communicated, in its formal federal way, that he had been waiting for this and was prepared for it, and that the appropriate people in the appropriate offices were already moving. Adelaide read the letter twice. He was already building a case, she said. Horace's correspondence with him, Holloway said. He was reading over her shoulder, which was something that had become natural in the preceding weeks, in the way of most things that become natural gradually, without ceremony, until you couldn't remember when it wasn't. Your father had been describing the irregularities in the local land filings for over a year. He just didn't have Vane's direct documentation. Until Creed, she said. Until Creed, he agreed. She folded the letter. The next 3 weeks were the procedural weight of what they'd survived. Federal investigators arrived from Cheyenne, 2 of them. Serious men in good coats who took notes and asked questions and treated Adelaide and Holloway with the particular careful respect of people who have been told something significant happened and are still determining how significant. They interviewed everyone available, including Marsh, who delivered a precise and self-interested account that was nevertheless accurate about the essential facts. They examined the letters, the deed, the survey documentation, Holloway's geological records, and the copies Adelaide had made by firelight on the night before the attack. Vane's attorney arrived from somewhere east and was loud in the immediate and quieted as the documentation was laid out in sequence, because there is a particular kind of legal argument that depends on there being no documentation, and this was that kind of argument. The Federal Land Survey records that Alderman produced from the Denver office showed 11 years of irregular filings across the Wyoming and Colorado territories, not all traceable to Vane, but a significant portion, his name or his associates' names appearing as beneficiaries of claims that should have gone to other people. 2 territorial judges who had issued favorable rulings in Vane-adjacent cases were removed from their positions pending investigation. 4 men in the federal land office in the regional capital were identified as having received payments that appeared in Vane's financial records under a heading he'd labeled, "with remarkable candor," as administrative accommodations. Adelaide testified for 3 hours on the second day of formal proceedings. She told what had happened, in sequence, without embellishment and without minimization, and she did not apologize for any of it. And when the federal examiner asked whether she had fired the pistol that wounded Rufus Vane, she said yes, with the same flatness she would have used to confirm any other factual matter. And she watched the examiner decide how to respond to that and then decide to move on. Holloway testified after her. She was not present for it. The examiner requested separate testimony to avoid cross-contamination of accounts, which she understood. When Holloway came out of the room afterward, she looked at his face and couldn't read it, which was sometimes true of his face and less true than it used to be. "Well," she said, He asked about the engineering of the Gulch charges, Holloway said. At length she looked at him. He found it interesting, Holloway said, with the not quite a smile. Professionally, she let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Almost. Horace Wren's reputation was publicly cleared in the third week of formal proceedings, when the manufactured debt documentation was formally identified as fraudulent and the record was corrected. It happened in a written statement rather than a public ceremony, which was the way of such corrections. The destruction was loud, and the repair was quiet, which was not justice exactly, but was what justice looked like in practice. And she had arrived at a place where she could accept at the gap between those two things, without it consuming her. She went to her father's grave on the day the statement was released. It was outside of town, on a rise where Horace had once told her the survey lines used to run before the territory was platted, where you could see the ridge from two angles, and the sky was wide in every direction. She stood there alone. She'd asked Holloway not to come, not because she didn't want him, but because she needed it to be hers. And she stood in the cold of late November with her coat pulled close and said nothing, because what she had to say wasn't something that converted to words without losing most of what it was. She stayed for half an hour. She left feeling different from how she'd arrived, which was the only thing she'd hoped for. Rufus Vane was tried in the federal circuit court the following spring, when the passes had fully opened and the machinery of territorial justice had assembled everything it needed. The trial was not brief. The documentation was substantial, the witnesses were numerous, and Vane's attorney made every argument available to him, with the persistence of a man being paid significant money to be persistent. It didn't matter. What Creed had taken from Vane's office was explicit, and what Alderman had built around it over 18 months of correspondence with Horace Wren was comprehensive, and what Adelaide and Holloway provided was specific and consistent and could not be rewritten because there were too many copies of too many things in too many places for the story to be changed after the fact. Vane was convicted on charges that included fraud, land claim falsification, conspiracy, and the orchestrated death of Horace Ellis Wren. He was not convicted of a clean charge that named what it was, the law of the territory in that year, did not have perfectly clean language for certain things, but the conviction covered what it covered, and Vane spent the remainder of his life in a federal facility, which was a different kind of diminishment than she'd imagined in her angrier moments, but was also more permanent than most of the alternatives. She did not attend the sentencing. She was by that point busy with other things. The Badlands claim was confirmed in their names, Adelaide and Bram Holloway, exactly as the deed stated, with a legal opinion from the Denver Land Office that was 3 paragraphs of technical language meaning, this is valid and the record is correct, and it always was. The mineral formation was exactly what Holloway's geological surveys had described. The surveying operation that began extraction that summer produced numbers that required Adelaide to sit down when she first read them, which she did in Holloway's chair by his fire, in the lodge on the mountain. Could have moved. They had the resources to live anywhere, do anything, become any kind of people they wanted to be. Adelaide thought about this, seriously thought about Denver, about the East, about the kind of life that money in quantities like this could purchase in places that had opera houses and universities, and the specific texture of a world that had more than one layer to it. She thought about what she actually wanted. She had learned something on the mountain that she didn't have language for. On the night she'd walked into the blizzard behind a stranger. The language had arrived gradually, assembled from the cold and the work, and the specific education of trusting someone who didn't make trust easy, and from understanding what her father had known about her that she hadn't fully known about herself. What she wanted was not the life she'd been waiting to live when circumstances permitted it. She had stopped waiting for circumstances to permit her life somewhere around the time she started hitting the large rock at 60 yards. What she wanted was this specific, complicated, imperfect, demanding life in this place with this person who didn't fill silences unnecessarily and built fires that lasted and had too many books and was teaching her, still, things she hadn't expected to learn. She wanted to build something that lasted. Not the lodge specifically, though the lodge was staying, and Holloway had already drawn plans for structural improvements that would, He noted without apparent awareness of the scale of the project, take about 3 years. She meant something larger, something that the mountain and the valley and the territory and the particular lesson of what happened when one man controlled everything for his own benefit at everyone else's expense, something that all of pointed toward, if you were paying attention. They used the first year's extraction returns to establish 3 things. The first was fair wage operations. The mining work that began on the Badlands claim was structured from the start with the practices of a different era than what was standard in the territory. Workers paid a wage that was actual money rather than company scrip, with housing that was built to be inhabited rather than endured, with operating practices that Holloway drafted from his engineering knowledge and Adelaide argued into existence against the resistance of men who said it couldn't be done that way and then watched it being done that way. Second was roads. Holloway had opinions about roads. He had opinions about roads that dated from his engineering training and had been refined by 11 years of navigating a mountain without them. And the roads that went in across the high passes that second year were designed by a man who understood terrain in 3 dimensions and built by workers who were paid what they were owed. And they were the kind of roads that actually worked, which in the Wyoming territory of that era was a more radical statement than it sounds. The third thing was the matter of Horace Wren's surveying legacy. Adelaide took a portion of what the claim produced and established through the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, a surveying grant program not named after her father, because that wasn't the point, and he would have been embarrassed, but designed around the principle that accurate land documentation was a public good, not a private tool, and that the territorial record should be clean and verifiable, and not subject to the administrative accommodations that Vane's letters had described so plainly. Alderman, who retired from the Federal Land Office the following year, spent 2 days with Adelaide in Cheyenne going over the structure of the program. He was a small, precise man who spoke in the measured cadences of someone who had spent decades being careful with language, and he told her that her father had been one of the best correspondents he'd encountered in 30 years of territorial work, which was the kind of compliment that only other careful people understood was large. He described you, Alderman said, toward the end of their second day. Adelaide looked at him. He said you were the person who should have been doing this all along, Alderman said. He said that was his mistake to correct. I'm glad you did it anyway. She did not cry in Alderman's office. She managed this. She cried in the hotel room afterward, briefly, which she had been scheduling since the mountain, and which was therefore not a breakdown but a settled obligation. And then she washed her face and went back to work. Holloway met her at the hotel that evening. He had been in Cheyenne for separate meetings. The Geological Survey Commission, that was mapping the territory's mineral resources, had questions for him that had already taken 2 full days and showed signs of requiring more. He came in from the cold looking like what he was, which was a very large, scarred man who had spent too many hours in meetings that were not his natural habitat, and he sat down across from her at the small table by the window, with the particular heaviness of a man who is tired in a specific way. She poured him coffee from the pot on the table. He looked at it. This is better than mine, he said. I noticed that about yours, she said. He looked at her with the expression she had been watching develop for over a year now, not the not quite a smile she'd catalogued in the early weeks, but the real one that reached his eyes, the one that still appeared without ceremony and without announcement, as if it hadn't fully decided to be there yet. The commission wants to hire me, he said. To do what? Survey consultant, the Eastern Territories. 3 months, maybe 4. She looked at him. Do you want to? She said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I haven't worked with other professionals in 11 years, he said. I'm not certain I still know how to do that. You know exactly how to do that, she said. You've just been alone long enough to convince yourself otherwise. He looked at her. You could come, he said. I have things here, she said. The grant program still needs structure. The Eastern Pass Road has the washout section that needs to be redesigned before spring. And someone needs to make sure the new extraction foreman doesn't cut corners on the housing specifications when he thinks no one's watching. She paused. 3 months is not forever. He was quiet for a moment. You'd be fine, he said. I've been fine for considerably worse, she said. I know, he said, and then that's not entirely what I meant. She looked at him across the small table in the Cheyenne hotel room with the December dark outside the window and the coffee between them and the year they'd had pressing against the moment from all sides. I know what you meant, she said. He looked at her steadily. Adelaide, he said. Bram, she said. He exhaled a short, slightly rough sound that was the closest thing to a laugh he produced in situations he found genuinely uncertain, which she had also catalogued. I'm not good at this, he said. At what specifically? He stopped, made a gesture with his hand that encompassed the table and the room and the two of them and the year and probably also 11 years of a mountain and everything that preceded it. I'm not asking you to be good at it, she said. I'm not particularly good at it either. I don't think that's actually the relevant skill. She folded her hands on the table. I think the relevant skill is continuing anyway, which we've both demonstrated we can do. He looked at her for a long time. Your father would have had opinions about this, he said. My father put my name on a deed next to yours, she said. I expect his opinions are fairly clear. Something settled in his face. The calculation that was always running, always reading situations and measuring and updating, she could see it arrive at something. A conclusion that had been building for longer than this conversation, longer than Cheyenne, longer probably than either of them had been precisely tracking. I'd like, he said, carefully, to ask you a question. When we're back on the mountain. Not here, she looked at him. All right, she said. I want it to be there, he said. Where it makes sense. Bram, she said. It makes sense anywhere. He looked at her with the real smile. Humor me, he said. She picked up her coffee. You have until we get back, she said. After that, I'm asking you. He laughed. An actual laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that happened when something caught him genuinely off guard. It transformed his face in a way she'd only seen a handful of times. And every time it happened, she was reminded that the enormity of him, the scars and the silence, and the years of solitude, all of it, was the shell of someone who had decided, at a specific and painful point in his history, that the world was safer when it didn't have access to this. He'd been wrong about that, not wrong to be cautious. Wrong to make it permanent, he asked her on the mountain. 3 days after they returned from Cheyenne, in the early morning when the light came sideways across the snow and the ridge above the lodge was sharp against the sky. He'd walked out before she was awake. She heard him and followed, pulling on her coat, and found him standing at the edge of the cleared space where she'd learned to fire the rifle, looking out at the valley below. He turned when he heard her. He asked her. He did it without a speech, without performance. He asked her the way he did everything directly, with the specific weight of someone who had decided to say what he meant without decoration, and who was aware of his own history and what it had cost and what he was offering in spite of that. She said yes. Not immediately, she made him wait approximately 5 seconds, which was not calculation, but the simple need to feel the full weight of the moment before it passed into the category of things that had already happened. 5 seconds, and then yes. He didn't sweep her into anything. He put his arms around her and held on, which was different and better. She held on back. And the mountain was quiet around them in the way it was quiet when nothing was threatening it, which was a different quality of quiet entirely. They were married that spring. When the passes opened and Frostbreak had its first warm weeks and the territory was trying to figure out what came next in the wake of Vane's trial and the reassignment of the lands and properties his network had controlled, Federal Justice of the Peace performed the ceremony in the lodge, which was the only venue that made sense. This was where their story actually lived, where the hard and real parts had happened, where she'd slept in the back room and learned to hit a rock at 60 yards, and sat with her father's death, and figured out who she was in the absence of all the structures she'd assumed were permanent. Marsh was there. He had, against most reasonable expectations, become something in the vicinity of trustworthy, not a changed man, not the subject of a moral transformation story, just a practical man who had landed on the right side of a situation and found that it suited him to stay there. He stood at the back of the lodge looking like a man who wasn't certain whether he was supposed to be at a wedding and had decided to be there anyway. She'd invited him. She didn't explain why to anyone who asked, and no one who knew the full story needed it explained. There was no one from Frostbreak. That had been a conscious decision. Not vindictive, she had moved past vindictive somewhere around the time she'd figured out that Amos Fitch looking at his cards was not the central fact of her story, just a true and unfortunate piece of it. But she had also not performed forgiveness she didn't feel, which seemed dishonest. And the people of Frostbreak were in the category of people she could understand without entirely forgiving, which was a category she'd had to invent because she hadn't previously needed it. Her life was not in Frostbreak anymore, it was here. That was the thing she understood most clearly on the morning of her wedding. In the lodge above the valley, with the spring light coming through the windows, and a man beside her who had walked into a saloon in a blizzard and changed everything by doing one decent thing when no one else would. He hadn't changed everything, actually. She had changed everything. He had created the condition under which she was able to do it herself, which was different, and also exactly the point. Years pass the way years do when you're working faster than you expect, filled with things you didn't anticipate, shaped as much by the problems you had to solve as by the plans you made. The roads were extended. The mining operations remained what they'd been designed to be, which required ongoing vigilance and the periodic reminder to various foremen that the specifications existed for reasons, delivered by Adelaide in terms that were specific and not gentle. Holloway took the commission consulting work and was, by his own surprised account, still capable of working with other professionals. He just had to relearn that professional disagreements didn't require him to go live on a mountain afterward. The surveying grant produced in its first 5 years 11 trained land surveyors working across the Wyoming and Colorado territories with documentation practices that were clean and verifiable. 3 of them were women, which was a fight Adelaide had not anticipated having, and won through the particular combination of documentation and stubbornness that characterized most of the fights she won. Alderman wrote to say that Horace would have been pleased about the 3 women. She wrote back to say she knew. The lodge on the mountain remained. They spent the early part of every winter there not because they had to, not because it was the only option, but because Holloway had built it with his hands in the years when he had nothing else, and it was the place where things that mattered had happened, and some places deserved to be returned to. She still fired the rifle. Not for the same reasons. The urgent reasons had been settled by time and justice and the particular finality of a federal conviction. She fired it because she was good at it now. Genuinely good. The kind of good that doesn't require effort because it has been built into the body over time. And because being good at something that was once terrifying is its own quiet satisfaction. Holloway still didn't talk much. She had stopped expecting him to be different about this, which had happened earlier than she might have predicted, and with less conflict than she might have feared. She talked more than him, and he listened better than most people she'd met, which turned out to be a more useful arrangement than the reverse. He still made terrible coffee. She had tried to address this multiple times with specific instructions and patient demonstration. The coffee remained terrible in a way that defied instruction, as if the coffee itself had decided that Holloway's version of it was the correct one and declined to be corrected. She drank it anyway. One evening, late in the 3rd winter since the mountain siege, she found him at the work table with the original geological survey spread out in front of him, not the copies. The original, the one he'd drawn in the years before anyone else knew what he'd found. He was looking at it with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was thinking about something that had roots in the past. She sat in her chair. "What?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Your father sat at this table," he said, twice, looking at this. "He asked me once whether I thought the formation was what the numbers said it was, or whether I was seeing what I wanted to see." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd been wrong before about things I was certain of, and I intended to be certain of more things before I acted on this one." He paused. He said that was the most honest thing he'd heard from a professional in 20 years. She looked at the survey. "He was a good judge of character," she said. "When he was paying attention." "He was paying attention," Holloway said. She looked at her husband, at this man who had built an exact and private life on a mountain, and opened it, with considerable reluctance, and then without reservation, to the daughter of the one person who had trusted him when trust was the scarcest resource available. At his hands with the grease that still accumulated in the creases despite everything. At the scar that she knew the full story of now, all of it told in pieces over the 3 years in the way that he told things he hadn't previously told anyone. The way he sat solid, present, taking up exactly the space he occupied and not apologizing for it. She thought about the woman who had walked into the broken spur in October of 1882 in a dress with a frayed collar, believing she had no options left. She thought about the 4 minutes after the blizzard, when the morning had been beautiful, and she'd allowed herself to exist inside it. She had more options now than she had ever imagined standing in that saloon. Not because Bram Holloway had given them to her, though what he'd done had made it possible. Because she had taken each one as it appeared, in conditions that were not ideal, and in circumstances that were frequently terrifying, and had turned them into what they eventually became. That was the thing about options. They weren't given. They were built from whatever material was available, in whatever conditions existed, by whoever was present and willing to do the building. Her father had known that. He'd tried to tell her in the language he had available, in deeds filed in Denver, in names added to documents, in 2 trips he'd described as visits to a cousin. He'd told her in the only way he could manage, and it had been imperfect and late, and she had had to figure out what it meant without him there to explain it, which was also, she had come to understand, part of what he was telling her, that she could figure it out without him, that she always could have. The fire burned down slowly, and the mountain held its cold, dark quiet outside the walls, and Adelaide Holloway sat in her chair in the lodge she had come to against her will and chosen to stay in of her own decision. And she looked at her husband, reading the survey that had started everything. And she thought, this is not the life I expected. It was better than that. Not easier, not smoother. Not the absence of hard things, there would be more hard things. She was practical enough to know that the territory didn't run out of hard things because you'd already had your share. But better in the sense that mattered, built by her own hands, on ground she understood, with a person she had chosen with her eyes open and had chosen again every day since. The woman who had been offered as payment for a debt she didn't owe had built something that no one could purchase and no one could take. That was the whole of it. That was everything.